In early October of 2021, a 31-year-old freelance software developer named Caleb Miller decided he needed to escape the relentless noise and fast pace of downtown Denver. Caleb spent most of his days staring at lines of computer code, managing remote database migrations for corporate clients, and dealing with the overwhelming congestion of urban life. When a major tech firm offered him a long-term remote consulting contract that guaranteed financial stability for at least 2 years, he immediately began searching for a secluded place where he could work in absolute peace, surrounded by nature and free from distractions. After weeks of searching online real estate listings, he stumbled upon a rental property that seemed almost too good to be true. It was a solitary, 2-story wood frame home located on the rugged outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, tucked away down a steep, unpaved logging trail nearly 3 miles off Highway 191. The house was completely surrounded by thick groves of quaking aspen and towering ponderosa pine trees, sitting on a private 2-acre lot that backed directly against a dense, unpopulated stretch of federal forest land. The nearest human neighbor was more than a mile away through the trees. The house itself had a rustic, cabin-like aesthetic, featuring a broad front porch, a stone fireplace in the main living area, a compact kitchen, and a narrow wooden staircase ascending to the upper floor. Upstairs, there was a spacious primary bedroom, a small guest room that Caleb quickly converted into his home office, a bathroom, and a narrow wooden ceiling hatch with a coiled pull string that led up to an unfinished attic crawlspace. The property had sat vacant for nearly 14 months following the passing of its previous owner, an elderly recluse who had lived there alone for decades. The monthly rent was unusually low for the square footage, a detail the out-of-state property management firm attributed to the remote location and the harsh winter conditions typical of the region. Caleb signed a 12-month lease on October 14th, loaded his personal belongings and high-end computer equipment into a rented moving truck, and drove north into the Rocky Mountains. For the first few weeks, the house felt like an absolute dream come true. The air smelled crisp and clean, filled with the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. Caleb loved the profound silence that descended upon the property once the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks. He spent his days coding by the living room window, watching wild turkeys forage in the clearing, and enjoying the total autonomy of living completely on his own terms. By mid-November, however, the brutal Montana winter began to set in. Temperatures dropped below freezing overnight, fierce winds howled down from the mountain passes, and heavy blankets of snow coated the roof shingles and blocked the gravel access road. Because Caleb worked irregular hours, often staying awake until 3 or 4 in the morning to coordinate with international clients, his internal clock shifted entirely to the nocturnal schedule. He became deeply accustomed to the natural groans and thermal pops of a timber frame house reacting to sub-zero temperatures. When you live alone in a remote cabin during a blizzard, your mind naturally rationalizes every unexpected creak or pop as settling wood, shifting snow loads, or small field mice scurrying through the exterior insulation. The first genuine anomaly occurred during the final week of November 2021. Caleb woke up around 10 in the morning, walked down the stairs to brew his morning coffee, and noticed a small, blue ceramic mug sitting neatly on the edge of the kitchen counter. Caleb stared at the mug for a long moment, feeling a strange flicker of confusion. He was meticulous about keeping his kitchen counters completely bare, and he distinctly remembered washing all his dishes the night before and placing them inside the upper cabinet. He tried to rationalize it away, convincing himself that he must have sleepwalked into the kitchen in a state of exhaustion, pulled the mug out, and forgotten about it entirely. He washed it again, put it back in the cupboard, and pushed the incident out of his mind. A few days later, another minor discrepancy surfaced. Caleb kept a small wooden catch-all tray beside the front door where he dropped his truck, keys, wallet, and spare house key every time he returned from a grocery run into Bozeman. One evening, as he prepared to drive into town to pick up supplies, the spare house key was missing from the tray. He searched his jacket pockets, checked between the cushions of the living room sofa, and looked across his office desk, but the key was completely gone. Assuming he had dropped it in the deep snow outside while bringing in firewood, he decided to look for it later when the snow melted, dismissing it as simple clumsiness. As December rolled into January 2022, these subtle anomalies began to change from misplaced items to strange, recurring environmental shifts. On multiple occasions, while working late at his desk, Caleb would catch a faint, lingering odor drifting through the second-floor hallway. It was not the smell of wood smoke or forest rot. It was the distinct scent of cheap, mint-flavored chewing tobacco, combined with the sharp, stale odor of unwashed wool. Caleb did not smoke, nor did he ever purchase tobacco products. Whenever he stood up to investigate the hallway, the smell would vanish within a couple of minutes, leaving behind only the standard scent of old plaster and dust. He told himself that perhaps the draft from the stone fireplace flue was pulling old residue down from the chimney stack, or that an animal had dragged nesting material into the exterior wall vents. Then, the auditory disturbances began in earnest. It was a frigid night in early February 2022, around 2:30 in the morning. A howling blizzard was raging outside, slamming dense sheets of snow against the glass windows. Caleb had his noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck as he compiled a complex software build on his workstation. In the sudden quiet between wind gusts, he heard 3 distinct, heavy thuds directly above his head. The sounds were dull, heavy, and spaced precisely 1 second apart, sounding unmistakably like the heel of a heavy work boot stepping down against bare plywood flooring. Caleb froze instantly, his hands hovering over his mechanical keyboard. His eyes locked onto the white drywall of the ceiling directly above his desk. He held his breath, straining his ears to listen for nearly 10 minutes, but the sound did not repeat. He eventually convinced himself that a large branch from one of the heavy ponderosa pines had snapped under the weight of the ice and struck the roofline. Even so, the deep sense of absolute security he had initially felt in the cabin began to evaporate. An oppressive, uneasy sensation of being watched settled over him, especially when he walked down the dark second-floor hallway at night or stood by the kitchen sink looking out into the pitch-black tree line. He started double deadbolting the front door every evening and began leaving the hallway overhead lights switched on throughout the entire night. By March, the winter frost began to loosen its grip, turning the snow into heavy, muddy slush and making the logging trail nearly impassable for a few weeks. Yet, despite the changing season, the missing items grew more frequent and specific. A half-empty jar of peanut butter disappeared from the pantry, only for Caleb to find the empty plastic container sitting upright in the outdoor trash bin 3 days later, even though he had not walked outside in sub-zero weather. A fleece blanket he kept folded over the living room armchair vanished entirely for a week, then suddenly reappeared neatly draped across the foot of his bed while he was out running errands. Caleb began to seriously question his own psychological stability. He wondered if the extreme isolation, combined with relentless 60-hour work weeks under artificial light, was causing him to experience dissociative memory lapses or severe sleepwalking episodes. He even began keeping a small digital voice recorder on his nightstand, hoping to capture proof of whether he was getting out of bed in his sleep. The breaking point arrived on the stormy night of the 18th of April, 2022. A heavy spring rainstorm had moved across the Gallatin Valley, bringing heavy lightning and sustained winds that knocked out the power lines to the remote property around 10 in the evening. Caleb lit several wax candles, placed them around the kitchen and living room, and sat at his desk working on a battery-powered laptop until exhaustion finally caught up with him around midnight. He shut down his electronics, walked down the dark hallway, and fell asleep quickly in his bedroom. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, Caleb was violently jolted awake by a sharp, metallic ping, followed immediately by the slow, agonizing squeak of old metal springs stretching under tension. He sat upright in bed in total darkness, his heart pounding against his ribs like a sledgehammer. The sound had come from the hallway, just a few feet outside his bedroom door. Caleb stayed completely motionless beneath the covers, straining his ears against the sound of rain drumming on the roof. For several long seconds, there was dead silence. Then he heard the faint, unmistakably deliberate sound of bare feet shuffling across the wooden floorboards of the hallway, moving slowly away from his door and toward the center of the upper floor. Caleb quietly slid his hand down to the floor beside his bed, wrapping his fingers around a heavy metal Maglite flashlight he kept for emergencies. He slipped out from under the covers with extreme caution, taking care not to let the mattress springs make a sound. He crept toward the open bedroom doorway, his breathing shallow, every nerve ending firing with adrenaline. He peered out into the dark hallway. The dim, flickering glow of distant lightning through the end-of-hall window revealed that the corridor was empty. But as Caleb raised his eyes upward, his blood ran completely cold. The rectangular attic access hatch in the ceiling, which had remained firmly closed and painted shut with layers of old white latex since the day he moved in, was hanging wide open. The wooden fold-down ladder was fully extended, its bottom rungs resting firmly on the hallway floorboards. A wave of cold, stagnant air drifted down from the dark opening above, carrying with it that exact same distinct, sickly sweet scent of cheap tobacco and unwashed wool that Caleb had smelled weeks earlier. Caleb stepped forward slowly, raising the heavy metal flashlight in his left hand. He aimed the beam up into the square void of the ceiling. The bright light cut through a thick cloud of swirling dust motes, illuminating rough-sawn timber rafters, thick layers of gray fiberglass insulation, and a narrow plywood walkway extending deep into the dark crawlspace toward the far eaves of the house. He placed his right foot onto the bottom rung of the wooden ladder. The old timber gave a quiet, ominous creak under his weight. He took a deep breath, pulled himself upward step by step, and pushed his upper body through the ceiling opening, sweeping the flashlight beam across the cavernous, dark attic. What Caleb saw tucked away in the far corner of the roofline, far beneath the sloping wooden eaves, made his breath catch instantly in his throat. There, neatly arranged in the shadows, was a fully organized, improvised living space. An old, threadbare mattress lay flat over layers of cardboard, covered by Caleb's missing fleece blanket. Beside the mattress sat a small battery-powered camping lantern glowing a faint amber. Several empty water jugs, a small pile of opened canned goods, a pair of worn work boots caked in dried mud, and a thick stack of spiral notebook pages filled from top to bottom with tight, erratic handwriting. Caleb slowly swung the flashlight beam to the left. Hanging from the wooden roof rafters directly above the mattress, suspended by thin strands of fishing line, was a large collection of printed photographs. Caleb stepped fully onto the attic plywood flooring, moving the light closer to inspect the images as the horror of the reality began to sink into his mind. Every single photograph had been captured from inside the house over the past 6 months. There were close-up shots of Caleb sitting at his computer desk with his back turned, taken through the narrow, cracked opening of his office door. There were pictures of Caleb asleep in his bed, photographed from the foot of the mattress while the room was pitch black. There were wide shots of the kitchen and living room, captured from high angles directly above the ceiling vents. And sitting right beside the stack of handwritten notes on the floor was a small ceramic dish containing a set of keys, including the missing spare key to the front door. Caleb stood completely paralyzed in the beam of his own flashlight, realizing with absolute terror that he had never been alone in the house for a single moment. Someone had been living directly above him for half a year, watching his daily routine, sliding down into his living space in the dead of night, and studying his every movement. As Caleb stood there, staring at the photographs in disbelief, a faint, metallic sound broke the silence from the floor below him. Downstairs, in the kitchen, directly beneath the attic walkway, the distinct click of the refrigerator door swinging open echoed up through the floorboards, followed immediately by the slow, heavy tread of footsteps heading toward the bottom of the staircase. The heavy footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase, the old pine treads groaning in slow, agonizing succession under the weight of someone ascending toward the second floor. Caleb did not hesitate. Pure animal panic overrode his disbelief. He knew that if he tried to climb back down the ladder, he would run directly into the intruder on the second floor landing with nowhere to run. Instead, Caleb clicked off the flashlight, plunging the attic into pitch blackness. He dropped to his hands and knees, crawling silently across the plywood boards toward the furthest, darkest crevice under the eaves, concealing himself behind a cluster of exposed fiberglass insulation bats. He gripped the heavy metal barrel of the maglite with both hands, tucked his knees against his chest, and forced his breath to remain completely silent. Below, the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, pausing on the second-floor hardwood. A moment later, the bottom rung of the fold-down ladder creaked under sudden downward pressure. Someone had just gripped it. Through the narrow gap between the attic floor joists, Caleb saw the dim, yellowish glow of a smartphone flashlight begin to illuminate the open ceiling hatch. Then, a head and shoulders emerged into the attic crawlspace. In the pale backlighting, Caleb could see the silhouette of a tall, gaunt man in his early 40s, wearing a faded plaid coat, dirt-streaked jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. The man climbed completely into the attic, reached down to his right, and effortlessly pulled the folding ladder upward, latching the hatch closed from the inside to seal off the opening. The man turned around, took 2 steps toward his makeshift mattress, and reached out to click on his amber camping lantern. As the dim yellow light filled the space, the man suddenly froze. His eyes swept across the mattress, locking onto the disturbed stack of notebook pages, the slightly shifted photographs dangling from the fishing line, and the fresh footprints pressed into the layer of attic dust across the plywood. The man did not call out. He did not ask who was there. He simply reached behind his lower back and pulled a heavy 8-inch fixed-blade hunting knife from a leather belt sheath, his head turning methodically toward the dark shadows under the eaves where Caleb was hidden. Caleb did not wait for the blade to come closer. With a roar fueled by pure survival instinct, Caleb lunged out from behind the insulation, swinging the heavy metal maglite with all the force in his body. The metal casing connected solidly with the side of the man's jaw, knocking him sideways onto the cardboard mattress and sending the knife skittering across the floorboards into the dark. Caleb did not stay to fight. He scrambled over the fallen man, slammed his palm against the attic hatch release mechanism, and kicked the folding ladder down with his boots. He hurled himself down the ladder, tumbled onto the second-floor hallway floor, bolted down the main staircase, and tore open the front door into the pouring rain. He did not look back. He ran barefoot down the muddy 2-mile gravel trail in the pitch black until he reached the paved highway, flagging down an early morning delivery truck whose driver immediately dialed 911. Within 20 minutes, multiple Gallatin County Sheriff Patrol vehicles sped up the private road, surrounding the isolated property with tactical lights and weapons drawn. When deputies entered the home and secured the attic, the man was gone, having escaped through a small, exterior louvered vent in the attic gable. However, bloodhounds picked up his scent trail in the muddy forest behind the house, cornering 44-year-old Thomas Rayburn, hiding inside a hollowed-out drainage culvert a mile into the federal forest. When detectives processed the attic and ran Rayburn through state databases, the horrifying reality of what had taken place came into full view. Thomas Rayburn was the estranged adult son of the elderly recluse who had owned the house before passing away in 2020. Rayburn had never left the property after his father died. When the bank foreclosed on the estate and put it up for rent, Rayburn had simply constructed a concealed habitat in the deep crawl spaces of the attic, living there rent-free while the house sat empty on the market. When Caleb moved in during the fall of 2021, Rayburn decided not to leave. Instead, he treated the new tenant as a bizarre, ongoing experiment in human surveillance. The spiral notebooks recovered from the attic contained over 600 pages of daily log entries, detailing Caleb's exact schedule down to the minute. When Caleb woke up, when he put on his noise-canceling headphones, what foods he purchased from the grocery store, and the precise times of night when Caleb was in his deepest stages of REM sleep. Rayburn had used the hollow cavity behind the hallway linen closet and a small access panel behind the pantry to slip silently into the living space every single night, harvesting food, taking photos of Caleb sleeping, and stealing small personal items just to see if the young programmer would notice. Caleb broke his lease that very afternoon, had his computer equipment collected under sheriff escort, and permanently relocated back to a high-rise apartment in Denver. He installed a comprehensive digital security system on every door and window, having learned firsthand that sometimes the quietest places in the world hide the most terrifying monsters right above your head. In late October of 2020, a 36-year-old residential restoration carpenter named Nathan Cross purchased a foreclosure property on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. Nathan had spent over 15 years working for high-end general contractors across Chatham County, specializing in historic framing repairs, lath and plaster restoration, and custom millwork. He had lived in cramped rental duplexes near the marshlands for most of his adult life, constantly putting his own savings aside with the singular dream of buying an older, neglected historic house that he could rebuild from the studs with his own hands. He finally found an attractive bank listing for a 2-story Dutch colonial home situated at the end of an unpaved sand and gravel lane off Isle of Hope. The house had originally been built in 1928, resting quietly on an acre of low-lying coastal land covered in massive live oaks dripping with thick curtains of Spanish moss. It had remained completely vacant and boarded up for nearly 18 months after the estate of its previous owner, a retired maritime radio telegraph operator named Donald Hensley, went through county foreclosure following Hensley's quiet death in a regional nursing home. The house had settled slightly into the damp coastal soil, the roof shingles were covered in gray lichen, and the interior carried the heavy, suffocating scent of stagnant moisture, oxidized horsehair plaster, and centuries of salt air drifting in from the tidal creeks. But structurally, the heavy heart pine floor joists were rock solid, the brick chimney stack was straight, and the property offered total privacy. Nathan closed on the foreclosure on the 4th of November 2020, parked his enclosed cargo work trailer in the gravel turnaround, and moved his tools and a folding cot directly into the ground floor living room to begin renovations. For the first few weeks, Nathan made extraordinary progress. He systematically stripped out rotten porch floorboards, repaired water-damaged window casings, and rewired the main electrical panel. His primary plan for the second floor was to convert the large southwest bedroom into his master suite. The bedroom was spacious, featuring high plaster ceilings, double-hung sash windows overlooking the marsh, and a wide closet built into the interior partition wall that separated the bedroom from the central hallway stairwell. However, as December arrived and the damp southern winter brought cold, foggy nights to the Lowcountry, a bizarre and deeply persistent issue arose in that specific upstairs bedroom. Every evening around 8 o'clock, as the outside temperature dropped and the marsh mist rolled across the live oaks, a faint, foul odor began to seep into the room. It was not the familiar smell of marsh gas, decomposing vegetation, or stagnant crawlspace water. It was a sharp, chemical sweetness heavily mixed with the sour, metallic scent of rotting copper and damp animal hide. Nathan searched every inch of the second floor. He pulled back the baseboards, set up specialized moisture meters against the exterior wall studs, and climbed through the attic crawlspace with a high-powered spotlight looking for dead raccoons or squirrels trapped in the insulation bats. Yet, the attic was completely dry and clean, the moisture readings were normal, and the odor consistently localized along one specific 8-foot stretch of the interior partition wall inside the bedroom closet. By the second week of January 2021, the nuisance escalated from an unpleasant smell to a bizarre acoustic and structural disturbance. Nathan would be lying on his cot downstairs in the dead silence of midnight, listening to the wind rustling through the Spanish moss outside, when he would hear a faint, dry scratching sound echoing from the second floor. The sound was rhythmically slow, dragging steadily from left to right behind the plaster, sounding like fingernails or a small metal wire scraping against rough wooden laths. Whenever Nathan climbed the stairs with a flashlight to investigate, the sound would abruptly stop the moment his boots stepped onto the second-floor landing. On the evening of the 22nd of January 2021, Nathan decided he had had enough. Armed with a heavy 20-ounce demolition hammer, a steel flat pry bar, a contractor-grade dust mask, and a halogen work lamp mounted on a tripod, Nathan entered the southwest bedroom, resolved to open the wall cavity, eliminate whatever animal nest was decomposing inside, and replace the old plaster with modern, mold-resistant drywall. He plugged his work lamp into an extension cord, illuminating the interior of the walk-in closet in harsh yellow light. He pulled his safety goggles over his eyes, adjusted his dust mask, and drove the claw of the demolition hammer straight into the center of the interior plaster wall, roughly 4 feet above the pine floorboards. The old lime plaster gave way with a sharp, dry crunch, releasing a dense cloud of white powdery dust into the air. As the plaster shattered and fell away, Nathan used his pry bar to rip off the horizontal wooden lath strips behind it. The moment the wall cavity was breached, the draft of air that poured out of the dark void was so overwhelmingly foul, dense, and freezing that Nathan instinctively stepped back, his eyes watering beneath his goggles. The stench of chemical preservatives, sour copper, and decomposing fabric was 5 times stronger than it had ever been in the open room. Nathan picked up his high-powered tactical LED flashlight, stepped back to the opening, and shone the beam directly into the space between the 2x4 framing studs. What he saw resting inside the wall cavity made him freeze in absolute confusion. Standard residential partition walls built in the late 1920s are typically hollow spaces measuring roughly 4 inches deep, framed by wooden studs spaced 16 inches apart on center. However, the interior wall of this closet had been entirely custom modified. The original wall framing had been doubled in depth, pushed out by an extra 14 inches into the closet space, and thoroughly lined from floor to ceiling with heavy sheets of galvanized sheet metal that had been screwed into the timber studs with hundreds of brass flathead wood screws. Tucked neatly inside this reinforced metal-lined vertical shaft, wedged tightly between 2 floor joists, was a massive, rectangular wooden shipping crate measuring approximately 5 feet tall, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches deep. The crate was constructed from thick, rough-sawn southern yellow pine planks, bound together around the edges by heavy flat iron bands that were secured with rusted iron rivets. Nathan knelt down on the dusty pine floorboards, shining his light along the vertical surface of the crate. Stenciled across the front wooden planks in faded black industrial ink was a shipping transit label from the United States Department of the Navy, dated the 14th of October, 1962, originating from the Charleston Naval Shipyard in South Carolina. Directly beneath the military stencil, someone had used a heavy black grease pencil to handwrite a single sentence across the pine boards. Do not open under ambient air pressure. Maintain seal until transfer to secure facility. Nathan ran his gloved hand over the oxidized iron bands. The wood of the crate was entirely dry, but along the bottom seams, where the pine met the lower floor framing, a thick, dark, tar-like substance had seeped out from inside the wood, congealing into a brittle, black crust on the subfloor. That dried resin was the primary source of the sickening, chemical copper stench that had haunted the bedroom for months. Nathan took his flat pry bar, wedged the hardened steel tip beneath the upper iron band of the crate, and tapped the end with his demolition hammer. With a loud, metallic screech that resonated through the empty house, the rusted rivets sheared off, allowing the top metal strap to spring outward. Nathan wedged the bar under the topmost pine plank and applied heavy downward leverage. The century-old pine board groaned in protest, splintering along the grain as the rusted cut nails pulled free from the internal framing with a sharp, dry pop. As the top plank lifted away by 3 inches, a sudden hiss of escaping pressurized air whistled through the gap, accompanied by a thick, freezing vapor that smelled intensely of industrial formaldehyde, sulfur, and oxidized lead. Nathan shone his flashlight beam straight through the open gap into the interior of the shipping crate. Inside the wooden exterior box was an inner casing completely fabricated from solid 3/4-inch thick lead plating, sealed along every seam with heavy industrial solder welds. In the center of the lead plate, a circular inspection viewport made of thick, yellowed, laminated quartz glass, measuring roughly 6 inches in diameter, looked directly down into the vacuum-sealed interior compartment. Nathan wiped away a thick layer of oily gray condensation from the quartz glass with the thumb of his work glove. He lowered his face to within inches of the window, pressing the narrow beam of the tactical flashlight directly against the glass. As the light penetrated the murky, preservative fluid filling the sealed lead chamber below, Nathan's breath stopped entirely in his throat. Submerged beneath the amber liquid inside the lead wall, staring directly up through the glass with wide, perfectly preserved, unblinking human eyes, was the pale, intact face of a young man wearing a vintage 1960s military-issue pressure helmet, and as Nathan stared into the fluid in paralyzed horror, he saw a series of fresh, deliberate scratch marks cut deep into the interior lead, lining directly beneath the glass, right alongside a small, battery-operated digital temperature sensor whose red LED display was actively blinking with a fresh date stamp from November 2020. The sight of that digital LED readout actively pulsing in the dark nearly caused Nathan's heart to stop. He stumbled backward out of the closet, his boots tangling in the debris of shattered plaster and broken lathwood. He hit the bedroom floor hard, his hands trembling violently as he pointed the flashlight beam at the opening in the wall. The low, chemical hiss of equalizing gas was still whistling softly from the sheared pine plank, filling the room with that freezing, medicinal vapor. Nathan scrambled to his feet, sprinted down the narrow stairs into the ground floor living room, snatched his phone from his work cot, and dialed 911. He told the Chatham County emergency operator that he had uncovered an unmapped, military-marked pressurized vault inside a residential wall cavity containing what appeared to be human remains and an active electronic monitoring device. Within 30 minutes, the quiet coastal lane off Isle of Hope was completely barricaded by Chatham County Sheriff cruisers, hazardous material containment units, and investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Because of the vintage Department of the Navy stencils and the heavy lead radiation-grade plating, federal authorities and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service were alerted and arrived on scene before dawn. A specialized CBRN hazardous materials team entered the second floor in full pressurized protective suits, setting up negative pressure ventilation units through the bedroom windows to contain the leaking chemical vapors. Using specialized, non-sparking pneumatic cutting tools, forensic technicians carefully removed the remaining wood planks and hoisted the 500-pound lead cylinder from the framing cavity, transferring it into a climate-controlled containment transport pod. Over the following 2 weeks, the forensic autopsy and the declassified historical inquiry conducted at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Dover, Delaware, unraveled an unbelievable 60-year-old covert chapter of Cold War military history. The preserved remains inside the lead capsule were formally identified as Lieutenant Robert Hensley, a 24-year-old United States Navy experimental test pilot who had officially been listed as lost at sea during a classified high-altitude atmospheric reconnaissance test off the Atlantic coast in October of 1962, right at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The former owner of the house, Donald Hensley, had not merely been a quiet, retired telegraph operator. He was Robert's older brother, who had worked as a senior logistics specialist at the Charleston Naval Shipyard during the 1960s. When the experimental aircraft suffered a catastrophic mid-air mechanical failure over coastal waters, military retrieval teams recovered the intact cockpit survival capsule and Robert's preserved body from the deep ocean shelf. However, due to the hyper-classified experimental biochemical cooling fluid and pressure systems utilized in the aircraft, the Department of Defense slated the entire capsule for deep ocean disposal to prevent sensitive operational technology from leaking to foreign intelligence. Donald Hensley refused to let his younger brother be discarded as a classified footnote. Using his high-level security clearance, forged naval transit manifests, and the chaos of the naval blockade deployment in late 1962, Donald intercepted the crated preservation capsule from the shipyard loading dock, transported it in an unmarked naval transport truck to his secluded Savannah home, and built the reinforced partition wall inside the upstairs closet to keep his brother hidden from federal recovery teams. For 56 years, Donald lived alone in the Dutch colonial house, quietly tending to the hidden chamber behind the bedroom plaster. The final, terrifying twist explained the modern digital readout and the scratching sounds Nathan had heard in the dead of night. Donald had not simply sealed the wall and walked away. Driven by severe grief and obsessive paranoia, he had maintained the chemical cooling system for decades, regularly accessing the interior cavity through a small, hidden hatch behind the hallway baseboard to check the pressure gauges. In late 2018, shortly before his health failed and he was admitted to a nursing home, Donald had installed a modern, battery-powered temperature and pressure data logger inside the inspection frame to ensure the seal would hold long after his death. The scratching sounds Nathan had heard through the plaster were not made by a living person inside the wall. Engineering specialists discovered that the internal mechanical relief valve on the vintage preservation tank had begun to fail as the winter cold contracted the lead welds, causing a small, brass counterweight arm to scrape rhythmically against the interior lead lining every time the room temperature fluctuated past midnight. Nathan's demolition hammer had breached the failing wall just days before the pressurized chemical tank would have suffered a catastrophic structural rupture. The Department of the Navy formally closed the 6-decade-old cold case. Lieutenant Robert Hensley was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by surviving distant relatives who had spent their entire lives believing his body was lost forever at the bottom of the Atlantic. Nathan Cross sold the Isle of Hope property back to a historical land trust early the following year. He walked away from residential structural renovations entirely, choosing instead to focus on building custom, freestanding furniture from clean timber where nothing could ever be hidden behind the walls. On the freezing night of the 17th of November 2020, inside the Clallam County Emergency Dispatch Communications Center in Port Angeles, Washington, a seasoned emergency dispatcher named David Kowalski was nearing the end of a grueling 12-hour night shift. The weather outside was brutal. A severe Pacific Northwest winter storm had battered the Olympic Peninsula for 2 straight days, knocking out power lines across several rural zones, causing minor mudslides, and washing out secondary access roads. Most of the calls coming across David's terminal that evening had been routine for bad weather. Reports of downed fir trees, vehicles sliding into ditches along Highway 101, and elderly residents inquiring about localized electrical outages. At exactly 2:43 in the morning, a priority call bypassed the regular queue and illuminated line 4 on David's console. David adjusted his headset, pressed the answer button, and delivered the standard greeting. Clallam County 911, where is your emergency? For the first 4 seconds, there was no human voice on the line. All David could hear was a faint, distorted hiss of static overlaid with a rhythmic, wet clicking sound, similar to someone lightly tapping a damp microphone against a hard plastic surface. In the background, there was a low, mechanical hum, followed by a heavy draft of wind whistling past a receiver. David repeated himself, speaking clearly into his headset. Clallam County, 911. This line is open. Can you state your location and the nature of your emergency? Then, a voice finally broke through the static. It was the voice of an adult male, but the tone of delivery was so completely flat, monotone, and devoid of natural inflection that David initially wondered if he was listening to a pre-recorded computer text-to-speech system. The caller spoke slowly, pausing unnaturally between words. I am looking at the front yard of 1248 Whispering Pines Road. There is a man standing beside the mailbox. He has been standing in the freezing rain for 4 hours without moving. David typed the address into his terminal. Whispering Pines Road was a remote, heavily wooded private dirt lane situated 12 miles west of Forks, deep inside the coastal temperate rainforest. The homes out there were separated by hundreds of yards of dense spruce and fern growth, completely dark, with zero streetlights and notoriously poor cellular reception. David looked at his dispatch map and responded, Sir, are you calling from inside 1248 Whispering Pines Road? What is your name? There was a long pause on the other end, lasting nearly 8 seconds. The rhythmic clicking sound continued in the background, steady and precise. The caller finally answered, My name is Wyatt Bennett. I am inside the house. I am looking out the second-floor living room window. The man at the mailbox is wearing a dark, oilskin rain jacket with the hood pulled tight. He has his arms at his sides. He has not changed his stance since midnight. He is looking directly up at this window. David made a note in the dispatch system and initiated a priority dispatch for the nearest Clallam County Sheriff Unit. Due to the severe storm and flooded roads, the closest patrol vehicle was currently 35 miles away, handling a commercial alarm near Beaver, leaving an estimated response time of at least 40 minutes. David spoke in a calm, professional tone. Wyatt, I have deputies en route to your location right now. For your safety, I need you to make sure all exterior doors and ground-level windows are firmly locked. Do not approach the individual. Do you have any exterior floodlights you can turn on? The caller replied immediately, his voice still unsettlingly robotic. The outside lights are already on. The beam illuminates his face. He is not blinking. His mouth is open slightly. His clothing is soaked through, but he is completely rigid. David felt a cold prickle of unease run down the back of his neck. Over his 15 years of handling emergency dispatch, he had processed hundreds of calls involving suspicious persons, prowlers, trespassers, and individuals experiencing severe psychological crises. But people in genuine danger almost always exhibited elevated heart rates, panicked breathing, trembling voices, or frantic speech patterns. Wyatt Bennett's voice had zero emotional resonance. His pitch remained utterly flat, as if he were reading a list of grocery items. David tried to establish more situational awareness. Wyatt, is there anyone else in the home with you tonight? Family members, roommates, or visitors? Wyatt answered, I live alone, but the man outside has moved. David sat up straight in his office chair. What is his current position, Wyatt? He walked past the gate. He is walking up the gravel driveway. His movement is not normal. He is dragging his left leg, but his upper body is completely stiff. He is holding an object in his right hand. David typed rapidly into the log. Can you identify the object, Wyatt? Is it a weapon, a flashlight, or a tool? It is a handheld digital camcorder, Wyatt replied, his voice maintaining that same eerie, deadpan pacing. The red recording light is flashing on the front of the lens. He is holding it up to his right eye, filming the front porch as he approaches the front door. David's pulse quickened. Wyatt, I need you to stay away from the windows immediately. Move into an interior room with a solid door, like a bathroom or a walk-in closet, lock it, and wait for law enforcement. Do you have a weapon to protect yourself if necessary? I do not need a weapon, Wyatt said softly. He has reached the porch. Through the headset, David heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of 3 heavy, wooden thuds echoing over the line. Someone was pounding on the heavy front door of the remote house. David leaned into his microphone. "Wyatt, do not answer that door. Are you in a secure room?" Wyatt did not answer the question. Instead, he spoke in a low whisper that sounded uncomfortably close to the receiver. "He is not knocking with his fist. He is hitting the door with his forehead." David felt a deep wave of nausea wash over him. The description was grotesque, unnatural, and completely outside the realm of standard intruder behavior. David pressed his headset closer. "Wyatt, answer me. Go to the interior room right now. Deputies are roughly 25 minutes out." Suddenly, the audio quality on the call shifted dramatically. The background hum stopped entirely, and the static cleared up, leaving an audio feed that was crystalline and sharp. Over the line, David heard the sound of glass shattering into dozens of sharp fragments, followed by the heavy thud of a boot stepping through a broken window pane and crunching across glass shards on a hardwood floor. Wyatt's voice returned, but this time there was a bizarre, almost rhythmic cadence to his words. "He has entered the lower foyer. He is standing at the base of the staircase. He is turning the camera upward." "Wyatt!" David yelled, abandoning standard protocol to raise his voice through the line. "Get out of there! If there is a back exit or a bedroom window, you need to leave the house immediately!" "He is climbing the stairs," Wyatt said. "He took 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He is pausing on the landing." Over the open line, David could clearly hear the heavy, slow creak of wet boots ascending an old wooden staircase. The sounds were unhurried, heavy, and methodical. Step by step, the intruder climbed toward the upper floor, the sound of labored, wet breathing growing distinctly louder in the background. David watched the GPS tracking icon of the responding deputy cruiser on his screen. The unit was still 16 miles out, navigating a washed-out logging road in torrential rain. Help was not going to arrive in time. "Wyatt, hide!" David urged, his own voice now carrying genuine tension. "Do not confront him. Hide under a bed. Get in a closet. Do anything to break line of sight." "He is at the end of the hallway," Wyatt said. The tone of his voice remained completely devoid of terror, sounding almost detached, like an outside observer narrating a scene from a great distance. "He is standing directly outside the doorway. He is pointing the camera at me." David listened intently, his breath caught in his throat. Over the line, a sudden, piercing electronic high-pitched squeal erupted, the familiar acoustic feedback loop that happens when 2 active audio microphones or communication devices are brought within inches of each other in the same physical room. Through the feedback, David heard the sound of heavy, dripping water hitting the floorboards, followed by the slow, raspy inhalation of breath right beside the phone receiver. Then, a voice spoke directly into the phone. It was the exact same voice that had called 911 from the very beginning. The exact same monotone, the exact same pacing, the exact same lack of human inflection. The voice whispered, "I am no longer looking out the window. I am looking into the mirror." Before David could respond, the line went completely dead, replaced by the flat, mechanical tone of an abruptly severed cellular connection. David immediately initiated an emergency reverse ping on the cellular tower that had routed the call. Because Whispering Pines Road was in an area with notoriously fragmented coverage, the initial dispatch had defaulted to the street address provided by the caller's verbal statement. When the computer completed the triangulation against the nearest 3 telecommunication towers near the coastline, the actual geographic coordinate data populated on David's monitor, the call had not originated from 1248 Whispering Pines Road. The physical cell phone transmitting the emergency call was located inside an abandoned, rusted industrial fishing cannery situated at the end of a deserted gravel jetty in Nia Bay, nearly 40 miles north of the dispatched address, an area that had been completely condemned and devoid of human inhabitants since 2014. At that exact moment, the responding Clallam County Sheriff deputy radioed through to the dispatch center, his voice crackling over the radio frequency. Dispatch, Unit 412. I have arrived at 1248 Whispering Pines Road. The property is completely dark. Checking the exterior now. David gripped his desk microphone, his knuckles turning white. Unit 412. Proceed with extreme caution. The caller reported the subject made entry through a shattered lower window. Triangulation on the 911 call has returned a major discrepancy. There was a tense silence on the radio channel for nearly 3 minutes as the deputy cleared the perimeter in the blinding storm. Then the deputy's voice came back over the air, sharp, hurried, and noticeably shaken. Dispatch, be advised. I am at 1248 Whispering Pines. All windows and doors are completely intact, locked, and undisturbed. There are no footprints in the mud, no broken glass, and no signs of any disturbance around the perimeter. But dispatch, you need to run a background check on the property owner immediately. David typed the land registry details into the county database. Unit 412, county records show the residence belongs to a 56-year-old man named Wyatt Bennett. The deputy responded through heavy static. That is impossible, dispatch. Wyatt Bennett did not make this call tonight. Wyatt Bennett was reported missing from this exact residence 3 years ago in October of 2017, and his case was never solved. Inside the quiet dispatch room, David sat frozen in his chair, staring at the glowing monitor. The 911 audio file had already automatically archived itself onto the county's digital server. David clicked on the playback waveform to review the final 5 seconds of the call, isolating the audio channels to clean up the electronic interference right before the line disconnected. As he enhanced the background layer beneath the caller's final words, David realized that the subtle, rhythmic clicking sound he had heard during the entire 12-minute conversation was not rain, and it was not static. It was the unmistakable acoustic sound of an old cassette tape deck, rewinding and replaying recorded human speech over and over again, directly into the microphone. The realization hit David Kowalski like a physical blow. The call had never been a live conversation. The flat, monotone pauses, the unnatural pacing, and the sudden shifts in audio quality were all the deliberate artifacts of pre-recorded audio fragments being triggered by someone operating a playback device on the other end of the line. David immediately contacted the shift supervisor and coordinated with the Nia Bay Tribal Police and the Washington State Patrol. 2 units stationed near the northern tip of the Olympic Peninsula were dispatched to the abandoned cannery off the coastal jetty, navigating the flooded roads through the teeth of the gale-force storm. It took the coastal units nearly 40 minutes to reach the desolate perimeter. The rusted, corrugated steel structure of the old cannery stood isolated against the black surf of the Pacific Ocean, battered by churning waves and howling winds. The officers breached the padlocked main loading doors with a Halligan bar and moved inside with high-powered tactical searchlights, clearing through rows of rotting conveyor belts, collapsed wooden catwalks, and pools of stagnant, brackish water. In the center of what had once been the primary refrigeration vault, 30 feet underground and insulated by thick, cork-lined walls, they found the source of the cellular transmission. Resting on a rusted metal workbench was a vintage 4-track reel-to-reel magnetic tape deck, hardwired into an external automotive battery and connected via an auxiliary audio patch cable directly into the charging port of a prepaid cellular burner phone. Beside the tape deck lay dozens of labeled cassette reels, a microphone mixer, and a pair of studio headphones. When investigators from the Washington State Crime Lab processed the physical evidence over the following 72 hours, the forensic audio breakdown uncovered a horrifyingly calculated timeline. The voice on the tapes really was that of Wyatt Bennett. Wyatt had not disappeared into thin air in 2017. He had been abducted from his home on Whispering Pines Road by an individual who had stalked him for months, documenting his habits, his voice, and his daily routines. In the years following his disappearance, the captor had meticulously recorded hundreds of hours of Wyatt speaking under extreme psychological duress, forcing him to read scripted sentences into a microphone in that unnatural, monotone cadence phrases describing intruders, describing looking out windows, describing entering rooms, and narrating horrifyingly specific acts of violence. The tape that had played over the 911 call on November 17th had been assembled from those very recordings, carefully spliced together to orchestrate a phantom break-in and manipulate emergency services into rushing to the abandoned Whispering Pines residence miles away. Mounted directly above the tape deck in the cannery vault was a battery-powered security monitor displaying 4 live video camera feeds. As the detectives examined the screen, their blood ran cold. The camera feeds were streaming in real time from inside the Clallam County Dispatch Center parking lot in Port Angeles, showing the employee vehicles, the rear exit door, and the perimeter fence. The perpetrator had not intended to lure police to Whispering Pines Road out of random malice. The entire 911 call had been an elaborate diversion designed to draw every active deputy and patrol unit out to the furthest, most isolated corners of the county, leaving the dispatch center and the surrounding township virtually unattended in the middle of a catastrophic storm. And resting right beside the live surveillance monitor on the rusted workbench was a single, newly recorded cassette tape with a handwritten label taped across the plastic shell. It bore a date marker set for the following morning, along with the neatly written name of the dispatcher who had answered the call, David Kowalski. In late November of 2020, a 35-year-old freelance video editor and digital media consultant named Liam Bennett was living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Duluth, Minnesota. Liam was an expert in high-definition video compression, optical artifact analysis, and color grading workflows. He made his living cleaning up camera footage for commercial production studios, local television networks, and regional law firms handling complex motor vehicle litigation. Because of his line of work, Liam had a methodical eye for small visual details. He was used to spending 10 to 12 hours a day seated in front of a pair of high-resolution calibrated reference monitors, scrubbing through video frames one by one, adjusting contrast curves, and catching tiny background anomalies that normal viewers would never notice. On the afternoon of the 1st of December 2020, Liam received an unexpected visit from his longtime high school friend, a 36-year-old county investigator named Deputy Travis Miller from the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office. Travis looked thoroughly exhausted, carrying dark circles under his eyes and clutching a secured external solid-state hard drive inside a padded anti-static case. 3 weeks prior, on the freezing night of the 8th of November 2020, a baffling incident had occurred along a desolate stretch of Old North Shore Road, an unlit, 2-lane rural blacktop winding along the rocky shoreline of Lake Superior. At approximately 11:45 that night, a 38-year-old high school physics teacher named Owen Vance was driving his 2018 Subaru Outback home from a late-night faculty planning meeting in Two Harbors. Owen was a quiet, reliable family man with zero history of mental health struggles, substance abuse, or reckless behavior. According to the official police incident report, Owen's vehicle had suddenly veered off the road at 50 miles per hour, smashed through a wooden guardrail, and plunged 30 feet down a jagged granite embankment, coming to rest against a cluster of frozen boulders just 20 feet from the icy waters of the lake. When volunteer firefighters and state troopers reached the wreckage 40 minutes later, the scene defied all logic. The Subaru was severely crushed along its front end, both front airbags had deployed, and the engine block was smashed backward into the firewall. Yet, the driver's side door was swung wide open. Owen Vance was nowhere to be found. There was no blood on the deployed airbags, no shattered glass on the driver's seat, and no footprints leading through the thin layer of fresh snow covering the granite boulders or the surrounding boreal forest. Owen had vanished entirely from the crash site without leaving a single physical trace. The only tangible piece of evidence recovered from the vehicle was a high-end, commercial-grade, dual-lens dash cam mounted behind the rearview mirror. The camera was equipped with an internal emergency capacitor designed to save the final 30 seconds of stabilized footage upon experiencing a severe collision impact. The St. Louis County investigative team and state collision reconstruction experts had reviewed the 30-second video clip hundreds of times over 3 continuous weeks. To the investigators, the dashcam footage appeared completely ordinary right up until the violent impact. The video simply showed Owen driving along the dark, deserted road through heavy fog, his headlights illuminating the empty asphalt and the tall birch trees lining the shoulders. Suddenly, at the 24-second mark, Owen's vehicle made an abrupt, violent 90-degree jerk to the right, crashing through the guardrail into the ravine. The official law enforcement consensus concluded that Owen had likely suffered a sudden medical emergency, experienced microsleep at the wheel, or swerved to avoid a deer that darted outside the camera narrow focal cone. The subsequent disappearance was tentatively categorized as a disoriented accident victim staggering into the freezing waters of Lake Superior and being swept away by the brutal undertow. The county search was officially scaled back on November 28th, but Travis could not shake the feeling that something fundamental was being overlooked. He asked Liam to run the raw, uncompressed video file through his professional forensic software to see if modern dynamic range enhancement could pull any additional clarity out of the dark, foggy night. Liam agreed to help. He loaded the raw video file onto his editing workstation, calibrated his color grading monitor to maximize shadow details in the 0 to 10% luminance range, and set the playback to loop at 1/4 speed. The footage began at timecode 11:44 and 30 seconds. The wide-angle lens showed the long, empty stretch of Old North Shore Road. The weather was miserable. Dense, swirling patches of freezing lake fog drifted across the asphalt, partially obscuring the yellow center line. The speedometer readout embedded in the lower corner of the screen showed Owen was traveling at a steady 51 miles per hour. Liam watched the forward-facing camera feed carefully. At second 10, 11, 12, the road was completely vacant. No oncoming headlights, no wildlife along the tree line, and no obstructions on the pavement. At second 23, the vehicle entered a sharp, unlit curve bordered by thick spruce trees. Then, at second 24, the Subaru violently jerked to the right, the front end smashing through the heavy wooden guardrail with a shower of splintered timber, followed by the violent, tumbling descent down the granite embankment before the video cut out upon impact against the rocks. Liam rubbed his chin, looking closely at the forward feed. Just as the police had concluded, the road directly in front of the vehicle appeared completely empty. However, Liam noticed that this specific dashcam model was a dual-channel unit, meaning it recorded both the front windshield view and the interior cabin view on synchronized split-screen channels. Liam switched the primary monitor display to focus entirely on the interior cabin camera, which utilized infrared illuminators to capture the inside of the car in the dark. The cabin footage showed Owen Vance sitting behind the steering wheel, wearing a heavy wool coat, his hands resting comfortably at the 10 and 2 positions. He looked alert, his eyes scanning the foggy road ahead through the windshield. There were no signs of drowsiness, no drooping eyelids, and no sudden slumping of the torso that would indicate a seizure or a heart attack. At second 22, 2 seconds before the crash, Owen's eyes suddenly shifted upward, locking on to the central rearview mirror mounted just beneath the camera lens. His expression transformed in a fraction of a second from calm concentration to sheer, paralyzing horror. His jaw dropped, his pupils dilated wide in the infrared light, and his shoulders locked rigid against the back of the driver's seat. Then, instead of braking or swerving normally, Owen intentionally and violently ripped the steering wheel to the right with all his strength, deliberately driving the vehicle off the road and over the cliff. Liam froze the frame at second 23, his pulse quickening. Owen had not lost control. He had not fallen asleep. Owen had looked into the rearview mirror, seen something terrifying inside or behind his car, and intentionally crashed his own vehicle through the guardrail to escape it. Liam immediately focused on the tiny, dark portion of the frame, showing the rear passenger seats through the interior cabin view. The rear cabin of the Subaru was shrouded in deep, heavy shadows, barely illuminated by the faint red glow of the dashboard instrument cluster. To the naked eye, the back seat appeared completely empty, showing only the headrests and the dark fabric of the rear bench. Liam opened a specialized spectral pixel isolation tool, pushing the shadow exposure by 5 full stops, lifting the black levels, and applying an edge detection filter to isolate contours in the dark. As the digital noise cleared from the enhanced frame, Liam felt a cold, suffocating wave of dread wash over him. Resting in the center of the rear passenger bench, positioned directly between the 2 front seats, just inches behind Owen's headrest, was the distinct, pale outline of a human figure. The figure had been lying flat across the rear floorboards beneath a dark tarp, slowly rising upward into the frame between seconds 20 and 22. The figure was wearing a tight, blackened neoprene diving hood that obscured the hair and ears, and 2 wide, unblinking human eyes were staring directly over Owen's right shoulder into the rearview mirror. And wrapped around the figure's right hand, raised just inches from Owen's neck, was a heavy, braided steel wire garrote pulled tight between 2 wooden dowel handles. Liam sat entirely paralyzed in his studio chair, staring at the frozen screen in disbelief. The St. Louis County investigators had missed the detail because they had focused entirely on the road ahead through the windshield, never enhancing the extreme low-light shadows of the rear cabin in the 2 seconds prior to the crash. Liam dragged the timeline forward past the crash impact to the final 3 seconds of the video, where the vehicle had come to rest against the frozen boulders of the lake. The front windshield was cracked and shattered, but the cabin camera remained functional on its backup battery capacitor. In the final 2 seconds of the recording, as the vehicle lay tilted sideways against the rocks, the driver's side door was kicked open from the inside. Owen Vance stumbled out onto the rocks, battered and disoriented, and following directly behind him, crawling out of the driver's side door with terrifying speed and agility, was the dark, hooded figure from the back seat, landing on the granite boulders in complete silence. The hooded figure reached out, grabbed Owen by the collar of his heavy coat, and dragged the injured teacher backward into the dense, pitch-black spruce forest bordering the water just as the camera battery finally died. Liam grabbed his phone with trembling hands, dialing Deputy Travis Miller's private cell number. Travis answered on the second ring, his voice sounding tired. "Liam, did you find anything on the forward road file?" Liam took a slow, deep breath, his eyes fixed on the frozen frame on his monitor. "Travis, get the sheriff and a tactical unit back out to the crash site on Old North Shore Road right now." Travis paused on the other end. "Why? What did you find?" Liam leaned into his phone, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Owen didn't crash because of the road, Travis. There was someone in the back seat with a garrote. And when the car hit the rocks, that person dragged Owen alive into the woods." Deputy Travis Miller did not waste a single second. Within 3 minutes of Liam's phone call, the entire St. Louis County Sheriff Office was placed on tactical alert, and an urgent multi-agency manhunt was launched across the desolate North Shore corridor. By 9 o'clock that evening, 4 unmarked tactical response units, state police tracking teams, and 2 high-intensity K-9 search units arrived at the rugged granite shoreline off Old North Shore Road. Floodlights turned the pitch-black spruce forest into stark daytime, cutting through the swirling coastal fog. The bloodhounds picked up a faint, distinct scent trail beginning exactly where the dashcam footage showed Owen being dragged into the trees. The trail did not lead toward the frigid open waters of Lake Superior, as previous search teams had assumed. Instead, it pushed deep into the rugged interior of the boreal forest, navigating an unmapped labyrinth of granite ridges and dense spruce thickets for nearly 2 miles. At approximately 11:15 at night, the K-9 handlers halted their dogs at the base of an old, overgrown rock embankment. Tucked into the side of the limestone ridge was an abandoned, reinforced concrete pump house that had once served a decommissioned iron ore rail spur in the 1970s. The rusted steel security door hung slightly ajar, secured only by a loose length of heavy galvanized chain. Tactical deputies moved forward in formation, breached the heavy iron door with a hydraulic spreader, and swept the subterranean concrete interior with weapon lights blazing. Lying in the far corner of the damp concrete room, bound with heavy nylon cord and suffering from severe hypothermia, but conscious and miraculously alive, was Owen Vance. Beside him, attempting to escape through a narrow rear drainage shaft leading into the woods, tactical officers tackled and restrained a 39-year-old man named Bradley Holt. When investigators processed Holt's background, vehicle telemetry, and personal history over the following 48 hours, the horrifyingly calculated nature of the abduction was fully exposed. Bradley Holt was a former independent logistics contractor who had lost his business after Owen Vance, acting as a regional physics consultant and forensic accident analyst for a corporate insurance review 2 years earlier, testified in a civil fraud trial that proved Holt had deliberately staged commercial transport crashes for insurance payouts. Holt had spent 24 months tracking Owen's daily schedule, memorizing his routes along the isolated North Shore corridor, and planning an act of private retaliation. On the night of November 8th, while Owen was inside the high school attending the late-night faculty meeting, Holt slipped into the school parking lot, picked the lock on the Subaru rear tailgate, and crawled beneath a black cargo tarp on the rear floorboards, waiting patiently for over 2 hours in the freezing cold until Owen got behind the wheel. Holt's plan had been to garrote Owen from behind along the deserted stretch of Old North Shore Road, steer the car into the deep lake waters to make the incident look like a tragic drowning accident, and escape into the night. He never anticipated that Owen would catch the sudden movement in his rearview mirror 2 seconds before the strike, recognize the lethal threat, and make the desperate, split-second decision to intentionally crash the vehicle into the guardrail to save his own life. Bradley Holt was formally indicted in Minnesota District Court on charges of attempted first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and felony assault with a deadly weapon. In late 2021, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 45 years in the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Oak Park Heights without the possibility of parole. Owen Vance made a full physical recovery, returning to his teaching career after months of rehabilitation. The St. Louis County Sheriff Office formally updated its forensic video review protocols to mandate advanced infrared shadow enhancement on all multi-channel dashcam files, serving as a permanent institutional reminder that the most critical clue in a life-or-death mystery is sometimes hidden in the pitch-black shadows where nobody thinks to look. In late August of 2022, a 39-year-old hydrogeology researcher and regional land surveyor named Dustin Miller was conducting extensive soil moisture and aquifer salinity assessments in the remote high desert of Esmeralda County, Nevada. Dustin was a meticulous, highly experienced professional who had spent nearly 15 years working across the arid Great Basin. He knew the extreme physical dangers of the Nevada desert better than most. The blistering daytime heat that routinely pushed past 105 degrees, the blinding alkali dust storms that could roll in without warning, and the total absence of cellular reception across thousands of square miles of cracked caliche basins. Dustin was driving a county-leased white 2020 Ford F-150 four-wheel drive truck, fully outfitted with auxiliary fuel tanks, heavy-duty off-road suspension, a long-range satellite data communicator, and specialized groundwater drilling equipment. His target area for that week was the remote, unpopulated expanse surrounding the Montezuma Range, roughly 35 miles west of the historic mining town of Goldfield. It was an austere, sun-bleached landscape of volcanic basalt ridges, dried mud flats, and endless miles of low-lying sagebrush cut only by a handful of rough, unpaved Bureau of Land Management utility trails that had not seen a grader in decades. On the morning of August 24th, around 7 o'clock, Dustin checked in with his regional project supervisor via a text message sent over his satellite device, stating that he was driving out to sample an abandoned agricultural borehole near the base of an isolated limestone butte known locally as Black Ridge. He confirmed that his vehicle was fully fueled, his water supply was topped off at 20 gallons, and he expected to wrap up his field readings and return to his motel in Tonopah by 7 in the evening. 7 o'clock that evening came and went with no check-in message from Dustin. By 10 at night, after multiple automated safety pings went unanswered, the project supervisor contacted the Esmeralda County Sheriff Department to report a missing surveyor. At 6:30 the following morning, August 25th, a search and rescue patrol led by Deputy Sheriff Wyatt Barnes set out in 2 heavy-duty patrol trucks, following Dustin's last known GPS coordinate track west from Highway 95. The morning sun was already beating down hard against the desert floor, pushing the temperature past 90 degrees before 8 in the morning. The air was dry and sharp, smelling of scorched dirt and bitter sage. Around 9:15, as Deputy Barnes crested a low gravel rise near the southern wash of Black Ridge, he spotted the white Ford truck sitting parked in the middle of a wide, sun-cracked, dry wash. The scene that greeted Deputy Barnes was immediately unsettling. The truck's four-wheel drive engine was actively idling, the low hum of the 6-cylinder motor vibrating through the desert silence. The vehicle's commercial air conditioning system was blasting on maximum, blowing icy air through the vents into an empty cabin. The driver's side door stood wide open, swinging gently in the hot morning breeze. Dustin was nowhere in sight. Deputy Barnes immediately approached the vehicle, his boots crunching over the brittle caliche crust. Inside the cab, everything seemed completely intact and undisturbed. Dustin's wallet was sitting on the center console, holding his driver's license, credit cards, and cash. His smartphone was resting in the cup holder, connected to a charging cable. On the passenger seat sat a half-eaten sandwich in a sealed plastic bag alongside 2 unopened bottles of cold water. In the back seat, his heavy field laptop was powered on, its screen open to a topographical mapping program displaying the surrounding terrain. There were 0 signs of a physical confrontation, no blood, no broken glass, and no indications that Dustin had experienced a mechanical breakdown or a flat tire. The truck was in perfect working order, with more than 3/4 of a tank of gas. Deputy Barnes called in the vehicle discovery to dispatch, requesting immediate air support and additional search teams. While waiting for the backup units to arrive, Barnes began examining the dusty ground immediately surrounding the idling truck. Because the dry wash was composed of a fine, powdery layer of pale alkali silt over hard clay, it preserved physical impressions with incredible clarity. Directly outside the open driver's side door, Barnes found a distinct set of fresh footprints made by heavy, lugged mountaineering work boots, matching the tread pattern of the boots Dustin had been wearing, according to his supervisor. The footprints told a deeply bizarre story. The tracks indicated that Dustin had stepped out of his running truck, stood beside the open door for several seconds, and then turned abruptly toward the north, heading straight away from the road toward the barren, vertical limestone cliffs of Black Ridge. Dustin had not taken his backpack. He had not grabbed a water bottle. He had not picked up his wide-brimmed sun hat, which remained resting on the truck's dashboard. He had simply walked out into the open desert, directly into the furnace-like heat of midday, leaving his running vehicle and all his survival gear behind. Even more troubling was the stride pattern of the tracks. The footprints were completely straight, spaced with mechanical, rigid uniformity, leading away from the truck in an unbroken line. Dustin had not stumbled, he had not run, and he had not looked back toward his vehicle. He had walked forward with absolute, steady determination, as though he were following an invisible guideline drawn across the desert floor. By 11 in the morning, a second ground team consisting of 3 volunteer trackers and a search dog arrived at the wash, accompanied by a Bell 206 helicopter from the Nevada Department of Wildlife. Deputy Barnes and the trackers followed Dustin's footprints on foot, moving across the blistering flats toward the base of Black Ridge. The heat was oppressive, radiating off the dark volcanic rocks in shimmering waves, blurring the horizon. For nearly 2 miles, the boot prints cut across the trackless desert, bypassing several natural avenues of shade and rock overhangs where a disoriented wanderer would naturally seek shelter from the sun. At approximately 12:30, the tracks entered a narrow, shadowless box canyon carved into the western flank of the limestone ridge. The canyon walls rose 60 feet straight up, composed of dark, fractured shale and jagged basalt boulders that blocked out any breeze, turning the floor of the ravine into a sweltering stone oven. The search dog, a seasoned Belgian Malinois trained in human tracking, suddenly stopped near the base of the canyon wall, whining softly and refusing to move forward, its ears pinned back in distress. Barnes and the trackers moved ahead, rounding a sharp bend in the canyon floor. There, tucked into a deep, natural recess in the solid rock wall that was completely invisible from the air, the footprints led directly up to an artificial structure that had no business existing on public BLM land. Set flush into the solid granite bedrock was a massive, industrial-grade steel blast door, measuring roughly 4 feet wide by 7 feet tall. The door was fabricated from thick, dark olive-drab steel, reinforced with heavy crosswelds, and coated in a dull, non-reflective industrial primer that had weathered into the exact color of the surrounding desert shale. It was completely recessed into the stone face, secured into place with heavy, 6-inch concrete anchor bolts drilled directly into the living rock. Barnes stood in front of the door, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. The steel door was not an old, abandoned relic from the mining boom of the early 1900s, nor was it a forgotten Cold War fallout shelter. Mounted directly into the center of the steel plate was a modern digital electronic keypad security lock, complete with a small, tempered glass biometric fingerprint scanner. The unit was powered by a heavy-gauge armored electrical conduit that disappeared into a narrow fissure in the rock above, and a tiny green LED light above the numeric pad was actively pulsing with a steady, rhythmic blink. Dustin Miller's boot prints ended right at the threshold of the steel blast door. Directly in front of the door, on a flat slab of limestone, investigators found Dustin's polarized field sunglasses and a small, handheld digital laser rangefinder placed side by side with neat, surgical precision. On the dusty ground beside the keypad lay a single white index card, held down against the afternoon wind by a smooth, polished riverstone. Deputy Barnes knelt down, keeping his eyes on the locked steel door. Written across the index card in clean, dark blue ink was a short, handwritten note. The truck was left running so the beacon would stay active. Do not attempt to force the hydraulic seal from the exterior. The pressure system is cycling. He is already on level 3. Barnes stood up slowly, the silence in the narrow box canyon suddenly feeling heavy and suffocating. He stepped toward the steel door, leaning his ear against the cold olive-drab metal. Beneath the thick armor plating, deep inside the subterranean bedrock of the mountain, Barnes could hear the faint, deep mechanical hum of a massive industrial ventilation turbine spinning up to speed, followed by the heavy, muffled sound of a pneumatic locking bolt slamming home deep underground. Deputy Barnes immediately stepped back from the blast door and keyed his shoulder radio, calling for an urgent tactical escalation and a specialized hazardous entry team from the Regional State Emergency Response Center in Las Vegas. Within 4 hours, a federal tactical engineering unit, accompanied by specialists from the Bureau of Land Management and the Nevada State Police, arrived in the narrow box canyon. The team brought industrial hydraulic cutting gear, thermal imaging scanners, and fiber optic borescopes. Thermal imaging sweeps of the rock face revealed a massive, climate-controlled subterranean structure extending nearly 80 feet straight down into the limestone bedrock, partitioned into multiple sealed vertical chambers. Using a diamond-tipped pneumatic drill, engineers breached a 2-inch inspection port through the perimeter seal of the blast door, equalizing the internal air pressure. They fed a fiber optic camera down the steel access shaft, illuminating the subterranean interior with high-intensity infrared light. The camera feed displayed a brightly lit, reinforced concrete corridor lined with industrial air scrubbers, backup battery banks, and rows of high-density server racks. Lying in the center of the primary decontamination foyer on level 3, conscious but suffering from severe heat exhaustion and dehydration, was Dustin Miller. Tactical breach teams overrode the electronic locking mechanism from the external junction box, forced the heavy steel door open on its pneumatic tracks, and deployed a medical extraction team down the concrete shaft. Dustin was stabilized with intravenous fluids and airlifted to a trauma center in Reno. Over the following 72 hours, federal investigators and the Department of the Interior untangled the bizarre, dark reality behind the hidden mountain installation. The underground bunker had not been constructed by the military or a survivalist cult. It was an illegal, off-grid research compound privately built 3 years earlier by an eccentric former telecommunications billionaire named Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton had hired private contractors to excavate the subterranean facility deep within public BLM land to house an unauthorized, unmonitored, closed-loop digital infrastructure. Dustin had not walked toward the bunker under a trance or mind control. While conducting his routine hydrogeology survey earlier that morning, Dustin had used his geological ground-penetrating radar equipment, accidentally picking up massive, abnormal electromagnetic interference pulsing from the bedrock of Black Ridge. Following the electronic signal into the ravine on foot, he stumbled upon the concealed blast door. When Dustin approached the exterior keypad to inspect the unauthorized structure, an automated interior vacuum lock, triggered by motion sensors, cycled open. Out of professional curiosity, Dustin stepped across the threshold, and the pneumatic door immediately slammed shut and sealed behind him due to an automated security lockout protocol. Realizing he was trapped inside a pressurized facility with no exterior communications, Dustin used an internal emergency console to manually route all auxiliary power to keep the ventilation system cycling, knowing that the only way he would ever be found in the vast expanse of the Nevada desert was if his truck was left idling with the satellite beacon broadcasting at maximum signal. Before the final inner airlock sealed him onto the 3rd level, Dustin had managed to slide the handwritten index card and his rangefinder out through the door's mechanical pressure vent to guide rescuers directly to the lock. The unauthorized facility was systematically dismantled and permanently decommissioned by federal authorities, with the entrance blast door filled with 30 tons of solid expanding concrete. Dustin Miller made a full recovery and returned to his land surveying career. But from that day forward, whenever his geological equipment picked up unexplained anomalies deep beneath the desert floor, he packed up his truck and drove the other way. In late October of 2019, a 34-year-old private security officer named Lucas Finch accepted an overnight security contract at the Mercer Valley Medical Center, an expansive regional hospital complex located in the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts. Lucas was an observant, highly disciplined former municipal auxiliary officer who had spent nearly a decade handling late-night asset protection, surveillance infrastructure monitoring, and facility access control. He preferred working graveyard shifts because of the quiet, solitary atmosphere, which allowed him to perform his duties without the constant interruptions and chaotic foot traffic of daytime hospital operations. The Mercer Valley Medical Center was an enormous, sprawling architectural hybrid. The central hospital pavilion and the emergency department were modern, 4-story brick and glass structures built in the late 1990s, fully equipped with high-tech keycard scanners, motion sensors, and bright LED lighting. However, the eastern and western peripheries of the facility incorporated older historic wings dating back to the late 1920s, which had originally functioned as a county tuberculosis sanatorium and later as an isolation ward during the mid-20th century. Among these older sections was Wing C, a massive three-story stone and masonry annex located on the fourth floor above the decommissioned physical therapy suites. According to county health records and municipal safety filings, Wing C had been entirely decommissioned, condemned, and permanently walled off in November of 1998 due to extensive asbestos contamination, black mold growth, and deteriorating structural concrete floor joists. During the facility modernization 20 years earlier, hospital administration had completely severed the utility lines to Wing C. The interior elevators were programmed to bypass the fourth floor annex entirely, and the primary entrance corridor connecting the main hospital to the old wing had been permanently sealed behind a thick, floor-to-ceiling partition of reinforced drywall and industrial cinder block masonry. On modern digital fire evacuation maps and computerized hospital floor plans, Wing C did not even have an assigned room number. It was simply represented as a large, grayed-out void labeled as unallocated mechanical plenum. Lucas worked the 11 to 7 night shift, accompanied by only one other guard, an older, laid-back officer named Arthur Gibbons, who spent most of the night monitoring the main lobby reception desk and checking in ambulance transfers. Lucas was responsible for conducting the physical walking patrols, systematically clocking into electronic checkpoint stations across the 7 interconnected hospital buildings every 2 hours. For the first 4 weeks of his contract, the assignments were predictable and routine. Lucas would walk through the dimly lit corridors, check locked pharmacy vaults, ensure medical storage doors were secured, and log any maintenance issues with the facility engineers. The older wings of the hospital were always cold and drafty, filled with the low, constant hum of commercial air handling units, the faint ticking of radiant steam pipes, and the sharp, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and industrial bleach. The disturbing occurrences began on the night of the 14th of November 2019, around 2:30 in the morning. Lucas was conducting his mandatory third-floor walking sweep through the Administrative Records Archive, an area situated directly beneath the sealed concrete footprint of Wing C. The hallway was completely dark, save for the green emergency exit signs casting long, pale shadows across the linoleum tile floor. As Lucas stood beneath an old, galvanized ceiling return vent to scan an electronic patrol barcode with his handheld scanner, he heard a faint, distinct sound drifting down through the ductwork from the sealed floor above. It was not the mechanical rattling of an air compressor, and it was not the high-pitched squeak of mice navigating the subflooring. It was the distinct, rhythmic cadence of human whispers. The voices were low, muffled, and indistinct, sounding like two people standing close together in an empty room, carrying on a hurried, urgent conversation. Lucas froze on the spot, lowering his scanner to his side and holding his breath. He tilted his head toward the metal ceiling vent, listening with intense concentration. The whispering continued for roughly 15 seconds, rising and falling in natural conversational inflection before terminating with a soft, hollow sound like a wooden cabinet door being gently pressed shut against a rubber gasket. Lucas walked back down to the security operations hub on the ground floor and brought the incident to Arthur's attention. Arthur merely laughed, waving his hand dismissively. Arthur told Lucas that the central ventilation shafts in the historic wings were notorious for acoustic channeling, explaining that sound from the active pediatric intensive care unit on the 3rd floor often bounced through the sheet metal ductwork and created strange auditory illusions near the old ceilings. Lucas tried to accept Arthur's rational explanation, but over the following week, the sounds became more frequent, more distinct, and increasingly localized. Every night between 2 and 4 in the morning, whenever Lucas reached the top of the central stairwell on the 3rd floor, he could distinctly hear movements echoing directly above his head, originating from the completely dark, sealed void of Wing C. The sounds were unmistakable. The slow, measured scuff of shoe soles dragging across bare concrete, the metallic clatter of small instruments being dropped onto a steel tray, and the low, continuous murmuring of multiple human voices whispering in complete darkness. On the night of the 22nd of November 2019, Lucas decided he could no longer ignore the disturbance. He was convinced that either unauthorized squatters had managed to find an exterior fire escape route into the condemned wing, or employees were using the unmonitored space for illegal drug use and theft of hospital medical supplies. Equipped with his duty belt, a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, a high-voltage stun device, and a master maintenance master keyring he checked out from the facility engineering lockbox, Lucas climbed to the 4th floor of the central medical tower. He walked past the quiet, locked offices of the hospital billing department until he reached the end of the western hallway. There, at the dead end of the corridor, was the massive, seamless drywall partition that had been constructed in 1998 to wall off Wing C. The wall was painted the same off-white eggshell color as the rest of the floor, marked only by a small yellow plastic sign reading "Authorized Maintenance Access Only, Sealed Hazardous Abatement Zone." In the lower right-hand corner of the wall, nearly hidden behind a large commercial floor-buffing machine, was a narrow, heavy steel access door measuring 3 feet wide by 6 feet tall. The door had no exterior handle, secured only by a high-security deadbolt cylinder and a heavy steel padlocked hasp. Lucas inspected the padlock. The brass body was covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust, and the shackle was firmly locked. However, as Lucas knelt down closer to the bottom edge of the steel door with his flashlight, he noticed a startling physical detail. The heavy, black rubber sweep along the bottom of the doorframe was completely free of dust. In fact, directly on the linoleum floor outside the threshold were 2 clean, fresh white marks, indicating that the bottom of the door had swung inward across the floor multiple times within the last few hours. Lucas pulled out the engineering master ring and found the matching brass cylinder key. He inserted the key into the deadbolt. The lock turned with a smooth, oiled, and completely silent click, showing 0 signs of internal corrosion or resistance. Lucas took a deep breath, pulled the steel door open by several inches, and clicked on his tactical flashlight. A freezing, dense draft of air poured out from the opening, carrying the heavy, suffocating scent of stagnant lime dust, aged copper, and a sharp, unmistakable medicinal smell of fresh isopropyl alcohol. Lucas stepped through the doorway, letting the steel access door rest lightly on its latch behind him. The scene, illuminated by his flashlight beam, was like stepping into an abandoned time capsule. The hallway of Wing C stretched out for more than 200 feet into absolute blackness. The walls were lined with crumbling, pale green plaster that was peeling off in long, dry strips, exposing the dark wooden laths beneath. The floor was bare, unpolished concrete, littered with scattered piles of rotted fiberglass insulation and fallen ceiling tiles. Along both sides of the corridor were dozens of open hospital patient rooms, their rusted iron privacy curtain tracks hanging twisted from the ceiling framework. There was no electricity, no running water, and no emergency lighting. The silence inside the wing was so absolute and heavy that Lucas could hear the soft, rhythmic rasp of his own cotton uniform against his chest. Lucas kept his flashlight beam low, scanning the concrete floor as he walked slowly down the central corridor. What he saw on the floor made his heart rate spike instantly. Cutting through the thick, gray layer of 20-year-old asbestos dust on the concrete was a clean, heavily traveled pathway of overlapping boot prints. The prints were sharp and modern, showing the lugged sole patterns of high-end tactical footwear. Lucas followed the footprints down the hallway, bypassing empty rooms filled with broken wooden bed frames, rusted IV poles, and stacks of yellowed paper patient charts from the 1970s. As he reached the far end of the wing, near what had once been the primary surgical suites and quarantine observation rooms, the layout of the corridor changed. The peeling wallpaper and broken plaster on the walls had been neatly scraped away and replaced with thick, sound-dampening acoustic insulation panels secured to the timber studs with heavy industrial staples. At the very end of the corridor was an old, double-hinged wooden door labeled Room 418, Special Observation. The double doors had been fitted with modern, heavy-duty weather stripping along every seam to create an airtight seal, and the small, wire-reinforced rectangular viewing windows had been completely blacked out with multiple layers of dark automotive window tint. Lucas stepped up to the door, pressing his ear flat against the wood. From inside the darkened room, the whispering voices were louder and clearer than they had ever been. There were 3 distinct voices, 2 males and 1 female, speaking in low, clinical tones. Their words punctuated by the soft, rhythmic clicking of electronic switches and the distinct, wet, mechanical breathing sound of a portable, automated medical ventilator. Lucas placed his gloved hand on the brass lever handle, pushed the door open an inch, and peered into the room. Illuminated by the eerie, pulsing blue glow of several battery-operated physiological vital sign monitors, the interior of Room 418 had been converted into a pristine, fully functional, modern intensive care unit. Sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by rows of intravenous infusion pumps and sterile surgical trays, was an active, motorized hospital bed. And lying in the center of that bed, connected to a running mechanical ventilator with an intravenous line running into his arm, was a patient whose hospital identification wristband bore a date of admission stamped with that very morning's date, bearing the name of an individual who had officially been pronounced deceased in the emergency room downstairs 12 hours earlier. Before Lucas could pull his radio from his belt to call for help, a heavy, gloved hand reached out from the pitch-black shadows behind the door, grabbing the collar of his uniform and violently dragging him into the dark room as the heavy wooden door slammed shut and locked from the inside. Lucas did not surrender to the sudden, violently shifting dark. The moment his back hit the cold concrete wall inside Room 418, his muscle memory and defensive training took over. He twisted his torso hard to the left, breaking the attacker's grip on his tactical collar, drove his heavy steel-toed boot into the individual's shin, and ripped his high-voltage stun device from his duty belt. In the chaotic, strobing glow of the blue medical monitors, Lucas saw 2 figures clad in full sterile surgical gowns, masks, and nitrile gloves scrambling toward him. Lucas drove the stun device into the chest of the nearest assailant, firing a 5-second electrical discharge that dropped the man instantly to the floor in violent muscle spasms. The second figure, a woman holding a pre-filled medical syringe, hesitated, retreating backward toward the operating cart. Lucas lunged forward, kicked the syringe from her hand, shoved her against the metal cabinetry, and hit the orange emergency distress toggle on his radio shoulder unit, screaming into the open frequency. "Officer in distress, 4th floor, sealed annex, Room 418, armed intrusion in progress." Down in the main lobby, Arthur Gibbons heard the desperate distress call cut through the silence of the reception desk. Arthur immediately hit the hospital facility-wide panic lock, dialed 911 for emergency state police tactical response, and summoned the on-duty facility engineering supervisor with master override keys. Within 7 minutes, 3 cruisers from the Massachusetts State Police Barracks in Lee and 2 armed municipal officers from the local department converged on the facility. Tactical officers, accompanied by the engineering supervisor, breached the sealed 4th-floor partition door, moving rapidly down the dark, abandoned corridor of Wing C with weapons drawn and tactical weapon lights illuminating the dust. They kicked open the reinforced door of Room 418, taking all 3 individuals in surgical gowns into custody at gunpoint without further gunfire. Paramedics rushed into the makeshift clinic, immediately securing the intubated patient on the bed, stabilizing his intravenous lines, and transferring him down to the active intensive care pavilion on the 2nd floor. Over the following 48 hours, the Massachusetts State Police, the Department of Public Health, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation unraveled one of the most disturbing, calculated black market medical operations in regional history. The intubated patient was 54-year-old Gregory Vance, a wealthy industrial real estate developer who had arrived at the emergency department early that morning following a severe induced cardiac collapse. The three individuals arrested in the room were Dr. Julian Mercer, a senior consulting anesthesiologist on the hospital staff, accompanied by two former surgical technicians whose medical licenses had been revoked years earlier. Dr. Mercer was the grandson of the original sanatorium founder and had maintained access to the unmapped architectural blueprints of Wing C for decades. Over the course of 18 months, Mercer and his associates had secretly transported medical equipment, portable generators, ventilators, and surgical drugs into the condemned wing during late-night maintenance windows, using the abandoned service hoist in the rear freight shaft that bypassed standard security checkpoints. The horrifying purpose behind the illicit facility was an elaborate, multi-million-dollar staged death and illegal organ procurement ring. Wealthy clients facing severe criminal indictments or overwhelming corporate debt would pay Mercer enormous sums to stage their medical deaths in the lower emergency department using specialized paralytic agents that mimicked terminal flatline brain activity. Once the patients were officially declared deceased by compromised staff, their bodies were diverted from the hospital morgue transit carts into the freight shaft and brought up to Wing C. There, inside the soundproofed observation suite, the patients were placed on life support, stabilized, and prepped for off-grid synthetic identity handoffs or clandestine tissue extraction procedures before being smuggled out through the rear ground floor loading dock under cover of night. The whispering voices Lucas had heard through the ceiling air vents were Mercer and his technicians conducting routine clinical checks and ventilator adjustments on their hidden subjects. Dr. Julian Mercer and his two conspirators were indicted in federal district court on dozens of felony charges, including attempted murder, medical fraud, conspiracy to harvest human biological material, and unlawful imprisonment. In late 2020, Mercer was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 45 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Raybrook, New York. Gregory Vance survived the ordeal, was placed under federal protective custody, and later testified against the operation in exchange for leniency regarding his own financial fraud investigations. The hospital board immediately launched an independent architectural audit, permanently demolishing the entire interior of Wing C down to the bare foundation beams, replacing it with an open-air rooftop solar array. Lucas Finch received a formal commendation for bravery from the Berkshire County District Attorney, but resigned from overnight private security shortly thereafter, taking a daylight administrative post with the state environmental police content to never set foot inside an old medical facility after midnight ever again. In early November of 2021, a 42-year-old digital forensic audio analyst named Jason Miller was working out of his private studio in Flagstaff, Arizona. Jason was an independent contractor who spent years cleaning up degraded audio recordings for regional legal firms, insurance disputes, and private investigations across Coconino County. He possessed top-tier spectral enhancement software, specialized noise reduction hardware, and an exceptional ear for isolating acoustic background anomalies that ordinary listeners completely overlooked. For most of his career, the work was technical, predictable, and quiet. But everything changed on the afternoon of the 9th of November 2021 when an elderly woman named Evelyn Cross walked into his downtown office carrying a battered cardboard box. Evelyn was 76 years old, visibly frail, and carried the heavy, unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had lived through decades of unresolved grief. Exactly 20 years prior, on the freezing night of the 12th of November 2001, Evelyn's 19-year-old daughter, Kendra Cross, vanished without a trace from the rural outskirts of Sedona. Kendra had been a bright, quiet art student at the local community college. On the night she disappeared, She was driving her 1997 green Honda Civic along an isolated stretch of Highway 89A through Oak Creek Canyon, heading home from an evening pottery class. Her vehicle was discovered early the following morning, abandoned on the gravel shoulder near an unpaved scenic turnout. The car was entirely undamaged, the doors were unlocked, the keys were still sitting on the passenger seat, and Kendra's purse, cash, and jacket were left inside. An extensive 3-week multi-agency search through the Red Rock Wilderness, dry creek beds, and steep canyons yielded zero physical evidence. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no foreign tire marks, and no footprints in the hard-packed red dirt. Over the years, the case grew ice cold, sitting in the archives of the Coconino County Sheriff Department as one of the region's most baffling unsolved missing persons cases. Evelyn set the cardboard box on Jason's desk. Inside was an old, discolored Panasonic landline telephone with a built-in digital answering machine manufactured in the late 1990s. Evelyn explained in a quiet, trembling voice that on the night Kendra disappeared, around 11:45 in the evening, the landline phone at their family home in Sedona had recorded an incoming voicemail message. When Evelyn and her late husband played the recording the next morning, all they heard was 30 seconds of distorted static wind rushing past a receiver and a series of muffled mechanical clicks. The local police had listened to it back in 2001 with the analog equipment available at the time, dismissed it as a corrupted pocket dial or an empty line from an automated telemarketer, and returned the machine to the family. Evelyn had kept that answering machine in her closet for 2 decades, preserving the digital flash memory chip by keeping the backup battery compartment dry and untouched. With the 20th anniversary of Kendra's disappearance approaching, Evelyn asked Jason if modern digital filtering tools could extract anything meaningful from the recording before she passed away. Jason took the assignment. He carefully extracted the uncompressed raw audio file directly from the answering machine's internal solid-state memory, imported the waveform into his high-end digital audio workstation, and spent the entire evening analyzing the file. The raw recording was 32 seconds long. When played at normal volume through high-end studio reference monitors, the audio was dominated by a harsh, continuous roar of wind shear and low-frequency electrical hum, completely masking whatever faint acoustics lay beneath. Jason began applying high-pass filters to strip away the low-end rumble. He then initiated a multi-band spectral subtraction process to isolate and remove the repetitive white noise of the cellular carrier band. As the layers of static were systematically peeled away, the audio waveform began to reveal a complex, multi-layered acoustic environment. At approximately 11 seconds into the recording, Jason heard the faint, distinct sound of a vehicle door closing with a heavy, hollow thud. It was not the light, tinny click of Kendra's compact Honda Civic door. It was the deep, heavy, metallic slam of a full-size steel truck door. Jason paused the playback, feeling a sudden chill prickle across the back of his neck. He zoomed in on the timeline between seconds 14 and 22, boosting the mid-range frequencies where human vocal patterns typically sit. He routed the isolated audio channel through a real-time vocal declipper and turned the output monitor knob up. Through his studio headphones, a human voice cut through the background silence. It was faint, hoarse, and breathless, but unmistakably the voice of a terrified young woman whispering directly into the phone's microphone. "Mom, I got in the back." He told me the pass was closed. "We just crossed the cattle grate near the microwave tower. He has a red." The voice cut off abruptly as a sharp, loud burst of acoustic interference tore across the track. Jason's hands hovered over the mixing console, his heart thumping hard against his chest. Kendra had not been snatched from the roadside by force. She had been deceived. Someone in a large truck had pulled up beside her broken-down car, lied to her about road closures through the canyon, offered her a ride, and she had gotten into the vehicle voluntarily. Jason immediately focused on the final 10 seconds of the recording, where the loud acoustic interference occurred. He ran the signal through a spectral frequency analyzer to determine what caused the sudden burst. The visual display revealed that the noise was not simple line static. It was a rhythmic, mechanical resonance that repeated at exact 80 millisecond intervals, accompanied by an underlying low-frequency droning sound. Jason adjusted the equalization curve, pulling out the harsh treble spikes and amplifying the acoustic reflections bouncing off nearby surfaces. As the sound cleared up, Jason realized he was listening to the interior of a running vehicle cabin. In the background, behind the mechanical resonance, was a steady, rhythmic clicking sound, the distinct acoustic tick of a mechanical mileage odometer wheel rolling over. And directly underneath that clicking, playing through a low-quality dashboard speaker inside the truck, was a faint audio broadcast. Jason boosted the radio signal by 18 decibels, isolating the voice of a late-night talk radio host. The radio host was discussing a regional high school football championship game between Page and Winslow, an actual broadcast that had aired live across northern Arizona on the night of the 12th of November 2001. Then, right at the 27-second mark, as the truck slowed down, another sound emerged on the track. It was the distinct, high-pitched mechanical whine of a heavy, two-way commercial CB radio transmission clicking open, followed by a harsh, deep male voice speaking inside the cab. Base 4. This is Unit 7. The gate at the cinder pit is locked. I am taking the access road down to the old timber lease. The male voice paused, and in the final 3 seconds of the voicemail, the microphone picked up the sound of a heavy, unlubricated handbrake lever ratcheting upward with 6 sharp, distinct clicks, followed by the metallic chime of a vehicle door opening into the freezing wind. Then, the call terminated with a sharp digital drop. Jason sat frozen in his ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing green waveforms on his triple monitor array. The background details were extraordinarily specific. The mention of the microwave tower, the cattle grate, the cinder pit, the old timber lease, and the unit identifier base 4 were not random phrases. They were geographic markers and operational call signs. The following morning, the 10th of November, 2021, Jason took his laptop, the enhanced audio files, and a printed forensic transcript directly to the Coconino County Sheriff Department headquarters in Flagstaff, requesting an immediate meeting with the Cold Case Homicide Division. Detective Marcus Vance, a seasoned 30-year veteran investigator who had originally worked as a junior deputy during the 2001 search for Kendra Cross, agreed to review the material. Marcus sat in the precinct conference room, slipping on a pair of over-ear studio monitors as Jason played the isolated, enhanced audio tracks step by step. As the whispering voice of Kendra Cross filled the room, followed by the deep voice of the truck driver announcing his location over the CB radio, Marcus Vance's face turned an ashen shade of pale. Marcus stood up from the conference table, walked over to the precinct archival map cabinet, and pulled out a large, laminated forestry map of Coconino County from 2001. He traced his finger from Highway 89A in Oak Creek Canyon, heading north toward the high volcanic plateaus of the San Francisco Peaks. There was only one location in the entire county that matched every single auditory clue on the voicemail. 12 miles north of Flagstaff, along an unpaved logging route off Highway 180, sat an old volcanic cinder quarry that had been operated by a regional aggregate excavation company in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Directly adjacent to the cinder pit was a high-altitude telecommunications microwave relay tower accessible only by crossing a heavy steel cattle guard grate set into the forestry road. And running directly behind the cinder quarry was a decommissioned 40-mile network of private logging roads that cut deep into the dense, uninhabited ponderosa pine forests of the Mogollon Rim. Marcus Vance immediately ran the commercial fleet registry for the aggregate excavation company that had held the mining lease on that cinder pit in November of 2001. The company had operated a small fleet of 9 heavy-duty commercial dump trucks and maintenance utility vehicles. Every vehicle had been equipped with private commercial CB radios assigned to specific operational unit numbers. Unit 7 was a red 10-ton commercial Kenworth utility flatbed truck, assigned exclusively to a single overnight maintenance mechanic who lived on a secluded 5-acre parcel off Forest Service Road 151. Marcus clicked on the employee registry file from November 2001, pulling up the state driver's license photo and personal history of the man who had been operating Unit 7 on the night Kendra Cross vanished. As the photograph loaded on the precinct terminal, Detective Vance looked at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The man pictured in the file was 58-year-old Donald Ray Croft. Donald had worked as the night mechanic for the aggregate company for 15 years before abruptly quitting his job in January of 2002, 2 months after Kendra's disappearance, claiming he was retiring due to chronic health issues. County land records showed that Donald had never left northern Arizona. For the past 20 years, he had continued living as a complete recluse on that exact same 5-acre wooded parcel bordering the national forest, off the very logging road mentioned in the 20-year-old voicemail. Marcus Vance did not hesitate. He coordinated with the Arizona Department of Public Safety, secured an emergency expedited search warrant signed by a county superior court judge based on the newly enhanced digital audio evidence, and assembled a tactical convoy of 4 unmarked sheriff SUVs and a mobile forensic command unit. At approximately 2:15 on the afternoon of the 11th of November 2021, the tactical convoy turned off Highway 180, crossing the heavy steel cattle guard beside the rusted microwave relay tower, and drove down the unpaved forest track toward Donald Croft's secluded property. The property was surrounded by dense ponderosa pines, completely isolated behind a rusted chain-link fence. Tucked beneath the trees was a dilapidated, single-story modular home with boarded-up windows, accompanied by a massive corrugated steel mechanics workshop at the rear of the clearing. Parked beside the workshop, half hidden beneath an oxidized green canvas tarp and covered in 20 years of pine needles, was the unmistakable shape of a vintage red Kenworth utility flatbed truck. Detectives and armed tactical deputies moved swiftly across the muddy gravel surrounding the modular residence and the steel workshop with weapons drawn. Marcus Vance stepped up to the front door of the workshop, flanked by 2 deputies with breaching tools, and shouted through the metal door, announcing the presence of the Coconino County Sheriff Department with a search warrant. There was no verbal response from inside the building. Instead, from deep within the cavernous, unlit interior of the steel workshop, the detectives heard the slow, heavy clank of a metal sliding latch being drawn back, followed by the faint, distinct mechanical hiss of an industrial hydraulic lift, slowly lowering a heavy iron platform down into an underground concrete pit beneath the floorboards. Detective Marcus Vance did not wait for the hydraulic mechanism to complete its cycle. He gave the signal, and 2 tactical deputies drove a heavy hydraulic ram into the workshop doorframe, shattering the industrial lock with a deafening bang. Armed deputies swept into the cavernous steel building with weapon lights blazing. The workshop smelled heavily of old gear oil, stale grease, and cold hydraulic fluid. At the center of the concrete floor was a recessed commercial automotive service bay, where a heavy steel plate had been modified into an improvised elevator platform descending 12 feet down into a reinforced subterranean bunker. Tactical officers covered the descent as Detective Vance climbed down the iron rungs of the pit ladder. Huddled at the back of the underground concrete chamber, surrounded by rows of old truck parts and tool racks, was 78-year-old Donald Ray Croft. He offered no resistance, dropping a pair of heavy pliers to the floor and raising his oil-stained hands as deputies placed him in steel handcuffs. Forensic units immediately descended on the property, conducting a comprehensive 72-hour excavation of the mechanic shop, the bunker, and the surrounding 5 acres of dense ponderosa pine forest. Hidden behind a false drywall partition in the underground service pit, crime scene technicians uncovered a locked metal firebox. Inside the box were Kendra Cross's student identification card, her house keys, and the missing silver necklace she had been wearing on the night of the 12th of November 2001. A ground-penetrating radar survey of the wooded perimeter led investigators to a shallow depression beneath a stand of young pines, where forensic anthropologists recovered Kendra's human remains, finally bringing her 20-year disappearance to a definitive, heartbreaking end. During subsequent interrogations with state prosecutors, Donald Ray Croft broke down and confessed to the crime. He admitted that on the night of the 12th of November 2001, he had spotted Kendra's stalled Civic on Highway 89. While driving the commercial utility truck back to the cinder quarry, he exploited the remote mountain setting, telling her that an early winter rockslide had closed the Lower Canyon Pass, offering to drive her to the highway maintenance depot to make a phone call. When Kendra grew suspicious of the unpaved logging detour and attempted to use her cellular phone to leave a hidden voicemail for her mother, Croft realized what she was doing. He pulled the truck over at the cinder pit gate, overpowered her, and brought her to his isolated workshop. Croft was formally indicted on charges of first-degree premeditated murder, aggravated kidnapping, and evidence tampering. In March of 2022, facing the death penalty, Croft accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to all counts, and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. On the 12th of November 2022, exactly 21 years to the day after she vanished, Kendra Cross was laid to rest in a peaceful memorial park in Sedona, with her mother, Evelyn, family members, and Detective Marcus Vance in attendance. Jason Miller returned the restored answering machine to Evelyn, having proven that even when 2 decades of silence settle over an unsolved tragedy, the truth has a way of cutting through the static when the right person is finally listening. In late December of 2021, a 32-year-old freelance mapmaker and geographical data surveyor named Isaac Sterling lived in total isolation on the eastern slopes of the Green Mountains near the small town of Warren, Vermont. Isaac spent the majority of his professional life processing satellite telemetry, drawing high-precision topographical trail guides, and working in complete digital solitude. When a major geographical foundation awarded him a multi-year grant to map regional mountain drainages, he chose to live where the work was right outside his back door. The house he rented was an A-frame timber cabin perched along an unpaved logging route known as Lincoln Gap Road. The structure sat on a heavily wooded 4-acre shelf of land surrounded by dense stands of sugar, maple, paper birch, and towering eastern hemlocks. During the warmer summer months, tourists occasionally drove through the mountain pass, but by late autumn, the town municipality shut down the road gates due to extreme ice and drifting snow, cutting off vehicle access entirely until spring. For 5 continuous months every winter, the only way in or out was by snowmobile or snowshoes. The nearest permanent neighbor lived more than 2 miles down the valley. Isaac loved the extreme seclusion. His cabin had a stone hearth that provided steady heat, a high-speed satellite uplink powered by solar batteries and a propane generator, and a wide second-floor loft that served as his bedroom and workspace. His companion was a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix named Jasper, an energetic, highly observant dog who usually alerted Isaac to every passing white-tailed deer or foraging black bear in the tree line. On the morning of the 22nd of December 2021, a massive winter storm swept across northern New England, dumping nearly 14 inches of pristine, powdery snow across the mountains. The wind howled through the timber frame all afternoon, shaking the glass gables and burying the front porch in thick, sculptured drifts. By midnight, the storm system broke completely, leaving behind an eerie, crystal-clear night sky with temperatures plummeting down to 7 degrees below zero. At approximately 7 o'clock the following morning, Isaac woke up to make his usual pot of dark roast coffee. He strapped on his insulated winter boots, pulled on a heavy fleece jacket, and stepped out onto the wide front porch with a snow shovel to clear the path leading down to the firewood shed. The morning air was razor sharp, freezing the moisture in his nostrils with every deep breath. The entire forest was painted in blinding white, bathed in absolute dead silence. There was no wind, no sound of distant traffic, and no bird calls. As Isaac pushed his shovel into the first fresh drift at the base of the porch stairs, his eyes caught a dark, broken pattern across the pristine surface of the snow. Beginning near the dense spruce thicket at the northern edge of his property line, a single line of deep, clean footprints cut straight across the virgin snowdrifts, heading directly toward the cabin. Isaac stopped shoveling, leaning on the wooden handle of his shovel. At first glance, he assumed a wandering hunter, an off-trail snowshoer, or a backcountry skier from the Sugarbush Resort had lost their way during the blizzard. But as Isaac walked closer to inspect the impressions, a strange wave of disorientation washed over him. The footprints had not been made by snowshoes, nor were they made by the heavy, lugged tread of modern winter mountaineering boots. The impressions were completely smooth on the bottom, narrow, and elongated, measuring roughly 12 inches in length. They looked exactly like the imprint of bare human feet, wrapped tightly in thin strips of coarse, untreated canvas or burlap. Even stranger was the gait. The stride length between each footprint was unnervingly long, spaced nearly 5 feet apart, meaning whoever made them was either extraordinarily tall or was taking massive, bounding strides through 14 inches of dense, freezing powder without dragging their feet. Isaac knelt down, placing his gloved hand into the center of the freshest print. The edges of the snow were sharp, crisp, and completely unmarred by wind drift. The tracks had been made within the last 2 hours, long after the blizzard had stopped falling around 5 in the morning. Isaac stood up and looked back toward the woods. A natural survival instinct urged him to go back inside, bolt the heavy oak door, and call the state police dispatcher in Waterbury. But Isaac was a cartographer and tracker by trade. His entire life was built around mapping terrain, reading physical signs on the earth, and understanding pathways. He whistled for Jasper, but the dog refused to step off the wooden porch deck, sitting rigidly by the front door, with his ears pinned flat against his head, staring silently into the trees with a low, nervous tremor in his chest. Isaac walked over to the firewood shed, picked up a heavy, steel-shafted splitting maul for protection, and strapped a pair of lightweight aluminum snowshoes onto his winter boots. He decided to follow the tracks backward to their point of origin, determined to find out who had walked onto his isolated mountain property in sub-zero weather without proper boots. The trail led Isaac across the open clearing, weaving through a dense cluster of young birch saplings, and descended into a steep, heavily shadowed ravine where a frozen mountain brook ran between granite ledges. As Isaac pushed through the knee-deep snow, the track pattern became increasingly bizarre. The footprints never hesitated. They did not slip on the icy shale near the brook, nor did they show any signs of fatigue on the steep uphill climbs. In several places, the tracks passed directly beneath low, jagged hemlock branches that sat barely 4 feet above the snow line. Yet, there were no broken twigs, no brushed-off snow, and no knee prints. As though the individual had bent their upper torso completely backward or sideways while continuing forward in a seamless, unbroken stride. Isaac followed the line for nearly a mile and a half deep into the wilderness, crossing the boundary markers of the Green Mountain National Forest. The trail eventually led to the base of an old, crumbling stone foundation, the forgotten ruins of a 19th century timber mill that had burned down in the 1880s. In the center of the snow-covered stone ruins, the footprints abruptly stopped. Isaac stood amidst the frozen limestone blocks, scanning the undisturbed snow around him in a 360-degree circle. There were no tracks leading away. There were no tracks continuing up the mountain ridge. The line simply terminated at the edge of a deep, dark vertical drainage well built from hand-cut fieldstone, descending 10 feet down into the frozen ground. Isaac approached the mouth of the well cautiously, holding the heavy splitting maul ready in his right hand. He leaned over the icy stone ledge and shone his headlamp beam downward into the dark shaft. The bottom of the well was completely dry, covered in a bed of dead brown hemlock needles and rotting wood scraps. Resting in the center of the stone pit was a torn, dirty sleeping bag, several strips of frayed burlap fabric covered in dried mud, and an open, rusted steel tin containing a small, modern handheld GPS unit whose green screen was slowly pulsing with a low battery indicator. Isaac felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The GPS unit had a digital waypoint marked on the map screen. The waypoint coordinates were set to the exact geographical location of Isaac's cabin on Lincoln Gap Road. Isaac stepped back from the stone well, realizing with mounting panic that whoever had lived inside the pit was not a lost wanderer. The individual had tracked his property with deliberate, electronic precision. Isaac did not investigate further. He turned around on his snowshoes and began retracing his steps as fast as his legs could move through the heavy snow, the silence of the winter forest now feeling intensely predatory and hostile. As Isaac climbed back out of the ravine and approached the tree line bordering his own clearing, he noticed something in the snow that made his heart violently skip a beat. Right beside the original single line of burlap-wrapped footprints he had followed into the woods was a second, identical set of fresh tracks. This second set of tracks was heading in the exact opposite direction, traveling out of the deep ravine, moving parallel to his own return path, and breaking into the clearing around his cabin. The snow inside these new impressions was so fresh that small, loose ice crystals were still tumbling into the center of the heel marks. Whoever had made the tracks had not stayed at the old mill ruins. They had been in the woods the entire time, circling behind Isaac through the trees, tracking his movements, and heading straight back toward the clearing while he had been looking down into the stone well. Isaac broke into an exhausting sprint, his snowshoes kicking up plumes of powder as he burst through the hemlock canopy into the open yard. His eyes locked onto the front porch of the cabin. Jasper was no longer sitting on the deck. The heavy wooden front door of the cabin, which Isaac had firmly pulled shut when he walked out into the snow an hour earlier, was standing wide open by 4 inches. The second set of fresh, elongated footprints did not stop in the yard. They ascended the 3 wooden porch steps in clean, single bounds, crossed the cleared deck planks, and led directly over the wooden threshold, disappearing into the dark, warm interior of Isaac's home. Isaac stood at the bottom of the porch stairs, his lungs burning in the sub-zero air, the heavy steel splitting maul trembling in his grip. The silence radiating from inside the cabin was total and suffocating. There was no barking from Jasper, no sound of shifting floorboards, and no movement behind the frosted glass gables of the loft. Isaac kicked off his aluminum snowshoes with 2 quick, fluid motions, leaving them in the snow. He mounted the 3 porch steps in dead silence, keeping his weight over the structural stringers of the wood to avoid any telltale creaks. He reached the front door, wedging his boot against the base of the frame to keep it from swinging open wider. Through the 4-inch gap, a faint, sweet smell drifted out into the cold mountain air. The scent of his own morning coffee mingled with the damp, sour odor of melting snow, wet earth, and unwashed wool. Isaac took a deep breath, raised the heavy splitting maul above his right shoulder, kicked the door wide with his left boot, and stepped inside. The ground floor was cast in deep morning shadows, illuminated only by the gray daylight filtering through the south-facing casement windows. Sitting on the floor in the center of the living room rug, completely unharmed but paralyzed with fear, was Jasper. The dog was staring rigidly up at the open timber staircase that led to the second-floor loft. On the polished pine floorboards between the front entryway and the stairs was a distinct trail of melting, slush, and dark, wet burlap imprints. Isaac moved forward with agonizing slowness, his eyes locked on the edge of the second-floor landing. As he placed his boot on the 3rd stair, a low, mechanical sound broke the silence from the loft above. It was the steady, rhythmic clicking of a computer keyboard. Isaac did not hesitate. He charged up the remaining steps, clearing the landing with the maul raised, his voice cutting through the house like a whip. "Get away from the desk!" Sitting in the ergonomic chair in front of Isaac's 3-monitor cartography workstation was a tall, skeletal man dressed in layers of frayed thermal underwear, his feet wrapped in thick bindings of burlap secured with heavy electrical wire. The man did not run, he did not lunge, he simply stopped typing, swiveled the chair slowly around on its casters, and looked directly into Isaac's eyes with a calm, vacant expression. Resting on his lap was an open, weathered topographical map from 1994, marked with hundreds of tiny red ink dots covering the Green Mountain Wilderness. Isaac kept the heavy steel blade of the maul pointed directly at the man's chest, backing toward the landline terminal on the wall to dial emergency dispatch. Within 40 minutes, 2 Vermont State Police cruisers and a specialized backcountry tactical unit from the Middlesex Barracks arrived on snowmobiles, breaching the gated pass and taking 44-year-old Silas Thorne into custody without resistance. When state police, detectives, and federal land investigators ran Thorne's fingerprints through the National Crime Information Center database, the terrifying truth of the mountain recluse was uncovered. Silas Thorne was a former state environmental surveyor and GIS mapping technician who had vanished from northern New Hampshire in 2016 following a severe psychiatric breakdown and an active warrant for criminal trespass and electronic stalking. Thorne had not been living in society for over 5 years. He had constructed a network of subterranean survival caches across the national forest, using historical topographical charts and stolen handheld GPS units to navigate the rugged wilderness completely off the grid. When Isaac Sterling rented the Lincoln Gap cabin to map the regional drainages, Thorne discovered that Isaac's high-resolution satellite database contained the updated, uncompressed geospatial files for the entire mountain range data that Thorne obsessively believed held the locations of forgotten survey markers from his past career. Thorne had spent 3 weeks observing the cabin from the tree line, memorizing Isaac's morning routines. On the morning of the blizzard, Thorne had deliberately laid down the bizarre, wide-strided footprints leading out toward the old mill ruins, anticipating that a trained cartographer and tracker, like Isaac, would follow the trail into the woods to investigate. The moment Isaac crossed into the ravine, Thorne circled through the dense timber, entered the unlocked cabin to access Isaac's computer workstation, and sat down to download the master mapping files onto a flash drive. Silas Thorne was charged with felony burglary, aggravated stalking, and unlawful entry, and was remanded to a state psychiatric security facility in Berlin, Vermont, for long-term clinical evaluation. Isaac Sterling terminated his lease on Lincoln Gap Road the following week. He relocated his cartography business to a secure, modern apartment in downtown Burlington. But for years afterward, whenever a fresh winter snowfall blanketed the ground outside his window, he never looked at a line of footprints without checking behind him to see where they were leading. In late September of 2018, a 28-year-old high-altitude trail runner and environmental science instructor named Julian Ward embarked on a solitary weekend trek through the rugged perimeter of the North Cascades National Park, located in northern Washington state. Julian was an exceptionally disciplined athlete who had spent nearly 8 years exploring some of the most unforgiving alpine landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. He possessed top-of-the-line cold-weather mountaineering gear, an advanced Garmin satellite communicator, and a deep, practical understanding of high-elevation survival. The specific area Julian chose for his weekend route was the remote Fisher Basin Trail, a notoriously steep and sparsely traveled corridor that branched off from the North Cross State Highway. The terrain in this part of the Cascades was defined by towering granite spires, vertical cirques, ancient glacial fields, and dense, tangled stands of western red cedar and Douglas fir that grew so thick in the lower drainages that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. On the morning of the 21st of September 2018, at approximately 6 o'clock, Julian signed the voluntary trail registry at the Colonial Creek trailhead. He noted that his planned itinerary was a 60-mile loop over Easy Pass, descending into the Fisher Creek Valley and returning via the Thunder Creek Trail by the evening of September 23rd. The weather forecast for that weekend called for clear, unseasonably mild autumn conditions during the day, with high temperatures reaching 60 degrees, but dropping down near freezing once the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. Julian was wearing a high-visibility cobalt blue windbreaker, black compression running tights, reinforced trail running gaiters, and carrying a compact 30-liter carbon frame backpack containing a 4-season bivy sack, high-calorie food rations, a lightweight water filtration pump, and a micro headlamp. For the first 36 hours, Julian's trek proceeded with textbook precision. His satellite tracking device sent an automated position ping back to his family in Bellingham every 2 hours, showing steady, strong progress up the grueling switchbacks toward the 9,000-foot ridgeline. On the evening of September 22nd at 7:30, Julian sent a manual text message through his satellite beacon from his high camp site near the head of Fisher Basin, camped at the upper tree line. Clear skies, no wind. Starting descent down the creek drainage at dawn. See you tomorrow evening. That was the last confirmed transmission ever received from Julian Ward. When Julian failed to arrive at the Thunder Creek trailhead by 9 o'clock on the evening of September 23rd, his brother immediately dialed the emergency dispatch line for the Whatcom County Sheriff Department and the National Park Service Search and Rescue Division. By 7 the following morning, September 24th, a massive, coordinated search operation was launched. Over 40 seasoned ground trackers, high-angle mountain rescue specialists, K-9 tracking teams from King County, and a high-altitude UH-72 Lakota helicopter equipped with forward-looking infrared thermal imaging cameras flooded the Fisher Creek drainage. The conditions for a search operation were practically ideal. There had been no fresh snowfall to obscure footprints, no high winds, and the river levels in the basin were running low and clear. For 7 continuous days, searchers thoroughly combed every single square yard of the trail, the surrounding talus slopes, the boulder fields, and the dense brush along the creek beds. They swept the entire 30-mile valley corridor 4 separate times, using specialized sonar equipment to scan deep glacial pools and lowering technical teams down into every crevasse and ravine within 2 miles of Julian's last known campsite. They found absolutely nothing. There were no dropped energy bar wrappers, no broken trekking poles, no scuff marks on the granite ledges, and the bloodhounds were unable to catch even a faint trace of human scent past the upper meadow where Julian had pitched his tent on September 22nd. His tent, his heavy sleeping quilt, his primary stove, and his spare clothing were all neatly packed away, meaning Julian had successfully broken camp on the morning of September 23rd and vanished into thin air somewhere along an open, well-defined 6-foot-wide dirt trail. After 9 days of exhaustive, round-the-clock searching that covered more than 120 square miles of backcountry wilderness, the official search operation was suspended on October 2nd, 2018. Julian Ward was officially classified as a missing person, his name added to the long, haunting list of individuals who had simply stepped into the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest and ceased to exist. For 3 continuous years, the case remained entirely dormant. The family held a memorial service, the trail registry logs were archived into county filing cabinets, and the wilderness of the North Cascades reclaimed the quiet valley. Then came the afternoon of the 14th of October, 2021. A 61-year-old retired United States Geological Survey hydrologist named Caleb Ross was conducting an independent, authorized soil and sediment survey near the base of Mount Triumph, a sheer 5,000-foot granite mass located approximately 14 miles northwest of where Julian had originally vanished. The area around Mount Triumph was designated as a Class 4 technical wilderness zone, meaning it was completely devoid of maintained trails marked by nearly vertical rock faces, impassable slide alder thickets, and deep, unmapped subterranean drainage fissures carved out by ancient subterranean glacial runoff. Around 3 in the afternoon, Caleb was scrambling across a narrow, unmapped shelf of loose basalt scree roughly 800 feet above the valley floor, searching for an active groundwater seepage point. As he maneuvered around a massive, house-sized glacial erratic boulder that had been split in half by centuries of frost wedging, Caleb looked down into a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock face that measured barely 2 feet wide and descended 15 feet down into the dark, subterranean bedrock. Wedged tightly into the bottom of that freezing, pitch-black stone crevice, resting on a bed of dry gravel that had never seen direct sunlight, was a bright splash of faded color. Caleb clicked on his high-powered field inspection light, aiming the beam straight down into the narrow gap. Lying wedged between the cold basalt walls was a carbon frame backpack beside a pair of worn trail-running shoes and a faded cobalt blue windbreaker matching the exact gear Julian Ward had been wearing on the morning he disappeared 3 years earlier. Caleb immediately stepped back from the ledge, recorded his precise GPS coordinates, and hiked 3 hours back to his vehicle to alert the National Park Service rangers in Marblemount. The following morning, the 15th of October 2021, a technical high-angle recovery team, accompanied by Whatcom County Sheriff detectives and forensic specialists, arrived at the remote basalt shelf via helicopter. The recovery operation was agonizingly difficult. The vertical stone fissure was so narrow that only a single, slender rescue technician, suspended from a mechanical tripod hoist, could lower himself down into the crevice while wearing specialized breathing equipment. When the technician reached the bottom of the 15-foot stone void, he quickly secured the backpack, the shoes, and the clothing into forensic transport bags. Then, as the technician cleared away the loose gravel at the base of the crevice, he confirmed that Julian Ward's skeletal remains were resting beneath the stones, completely undisturbed by wildlife and fully intact. The recovery of the remains brought an immediate, overwhelming sense of closure to the long-standing cold case. The initial working theory seemed straightforward. Julian had somehow become disoriented on the morning of the 23rd of September 2018, wandered 14 miles off route into the technical terrain of Mount Triumph, lost his footing on the loose basalt scree, and tumbled down into the narrow fissure, where he tragically succumbed to the elements. However, as the forensic team and lead detectives began systematically cataloging the physical items recovered from the bottom of the crevice inside the Mobile Field Command Unit, a series of bizarre, inexplicable physical contradictions began to emerge that shattered the simple accident theory entirely. First was the location itself. To reach that specific basalt shelf on Mount Triumph from the Fisher Creek drainage, a hiker on foot would have had to cross 3 separate 9,000-foot mountain passes, navigate 2 impassable Class 5 technical rock faces that required specialized rope systems and ice axes, and swim across the freezing, torrential currents of the Baker River. It was a route that seasoned mountaineering experts calculated would have taken at least 5 to 6 days of extreme, non-stop physical exertion for a fully equipped mountaineer, let alone a lightweight trail runner carrying only 2 days of rations. Second was the condition of Julian's footwear and gear. The trail running shoes recovered from the bottom of the fissure showed zero wear on the rubber tread. The synthetic soles were pristine, the laces were tied in double knots, and the fabric was entirely free of the typical rock abrasions or mud accumulation that would have inevitably occurred during a grueling 14-mile trek across jagged scree fields. Third, and most unnerving, was Julian's personal belongings. Inside the zippered side pocket of the cobalt blue windbreaker, detectives found Julian's wallet, his untouched driver's license, his fully functional Garmin satellite communicator, and his water-resistant digital watch. The battery on the digital watch was still functioning on its long-life lithium cell, The automated internal calendar on the watch had recorded continuous, uninterrupted biological pulse telemetry data from the wrist sensor, storing the exact physiological timeline of the wearer directly onto its internal flash memory chip. The detectives plugged the digital watch into the forensic field terminal to extract the telemetry log and pinpoint the exact time and date Julian had passed away inside the crevice in late September 2018. The forensic software completed the data extraction, and the daily activity graphs loaded across the high-resolution laptop screen. The lead investigator leaned forward, his eyes scanning the digital timeline, and felt a cold, paralyzing shock settle deep into his chest. According to the uncorrupted, factory-calibrated internal sensor on the watch, Julian's heart rate had not stopped beating in late September of 2018. The biometric data showed that Julian's pulse had remained completely steady, active, and healthy through all of 2019, through all of 2020, and all through the spring and summer of 2021. The final, absolute flatline of his heart rate had been recorded by the watch sensor on the 10th of October 2021, just 4 days before Caleb Ross looked down into the rock crevice. And resting on top of the dry gravel directly beneath Julian's boots was a clean, modern plastic parking receipt stamped and printed from a commercial parking garage in downtown Seattle, carrying an automated timestamp from the 8th of October 2021 at 2:15 in the afternoon. The mobile command unit inside the Marble Mount Ranger Station fell dead silent. The lead investigator stared at the parking receipt in a sterile evidence bag, his hands shaking slightly against the metal table. The receipt was pristine. It was printed on heat-sensitive thermal paper from the Pacific Place garage on 6th Avenue in downtown Seattle. The ink had not degraded from months in the elements. It had been spit out by an automated terminal less than a week prior. Within 48 hours, the case transformed from a simple wilderness recovery into a massive multi-jurisdictional criminal inquiry involving the Seattle Police Department, the FBI, and the Washington State Patrol. Detectives pulled the municipal security camera feeds from the Pacific Place garage for the afternoon of the 8th of October 2021. At exactly 2:15, a dark gray commercial utility van entered the subterranean structure. The automated camera caught the driver pulling the parking ticket from the dispenser. The man behind the wheel was not Julian Ward. It was a 52-year-old former state park maintenance mechanic named Arthur Vance, who had been dishonorably discharged from government service in early 2019 following an internal investigation into missing master keys and unauthorized access to remote historical administrative cabins. Federal agents executed an emergency search warrant on a secluded, off-grid 5-acre homestead owned by Vance in the foothills outside Concrete, Washington, less than 20 miles from the Mount Triumph trailhead. When tactical units breached the subterranean concrete storm cellar behind Vance's property, the chilling truth behind the 3-year mystery was finally exposed. The underground storm cellar had been converted into a soundproofed, reinforced holding room containing dry food provisions, a single bed, and hundreds of forestry maps marked with remote, high-altitude topographical coordinates. In late September of 2018, Arthur Vance had been driving an unmarked park maintenance truck along a restricted logging service road that crossed the lower Fisher Creek drainage. He had encountered Julian Ward coming off the trail, offered him transport under the pretense of a severe washout ahead, and subdued him with a chemical tranquilizer once Julian entered the cab. For 3 years, Vance kept Julian locked in the isolated concrete shelter. He did not harm him physically, but Vance suffered from a severe, delusional fixation on wilderness survivalism and federal territorial control, believing he was protecting selected individuals from an impending societal collapse. He forced Julian to maintain a strict physical conditioning routine, allowing him to wear his digital fitness watch to track his vitals as part of his rigid, obsessive regimen. In early October of 2021, When local county tax assessors and environmental inspectors scheduled an on-site property boundary audit of Vance's homestead, Vance panicked. Realizing the bunker would be discovered, Vance administered a lethal dose of fast-acting barbiturates to Julian on the evening of October 9th. Knowing the search and rescue protocols of the North Cascades intimately from his decades as a park mechanic, Vance loaded Julian's body, along with his original backpack and untouched gear, into a heavy-duty transport frame. Using a private industrial service road and a decommissioned mining winch system that bypassed the impassable river crossings, Vance hauled the body up the backside of Mount Triumph under the cover of night, dropping Julian into the narrow, unmapped basalt crevice. He believed the deep fissure would remain hidden forever, or if ever found, the death would simply be dismissed as a tragic hiking accident from 2018. He had forgotten a single critical detail. When he picked up the utility van from a Seattle service garage 48 hours earlier, he had tossed the parking receipt onto the floorboard, and it had stuck to the tread of Julian's pristine shoes as he carried him into the crevice. Arthur Vance was arrested without incident at a truck stop outside Spokane while attempting to flee east into Idaho. In late 2022, he was convicted in federal district court on charges of aggravated kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and first-degree murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Julian Ward was finally returned home to Bellingham, bringing an end to an impossible case that proved that the darkest mysteries of the wilderness sometimes have nothing to do with the woods at all, but with the human monsters hiding within them. In early October of 2017, a 45-year-old lead detective named Ryan Vance was stationed in the small, picturesque coastal town of Camden, Maine. Ryan had spent nearly 2 decades in law enforcement, handling everything from property disputes to seasonal tourist incidents across Knox County. Camden was the kind of idyllic New England harbor town where violent crime was virtually non-existent. People left their front doors unlocked, fishermen greeted shop owners by name along the rocky wharves, and the quiet rhythm of daily life was dictated largely by the changing tides and the arrival of autumn leaf peepers. However, that peace was shattered on the rainy night of the 24th of October 2017, when a prominent local maritime historian and antique book dealer named Gregory Vance vanished without a trace. Gregory was a 72-year-old widower who lived alone in a grand 3-story, cedar-shingled home perched on a granite bluff overlooking Penobscot Bay. He was a creature of absolute habit. Every morning at 7, he walked down to the Harbor Bakery for black coffee, spent his afternoons archiving historical coastal charts in his private study, and dined at the local tavern by 6. When Gregory failed to show up at his bookshop for 2 consecutive days, and his front door was found standing unlocked during a nor'easter, neighbors immediately dialed the Knox County Sheriff Department. Ryan Vance led the investigation from day 1. Inside Gregory's house, detectives found no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, and no indications of a physical struggle. Gregory's wallet, cell phone, passport, and vehicle were all left behind. The only anomaly was Gregory's motorized 22-foot wooden dory, which was missing from its private dock at the base of the granite bluff. 4 days into the massive search, the Coast Guard located the dory drifting aimlessly 12 miles offshore near the rocky shoals of Vinalhaven Island. The vessel was completely intact, the outboard engine was out of fuel, and the ignition key was turned to the run position. Inside the boat, investigators found Gregory's oilskin rain slicker neatly folded on the wooden bench, along with an open thermos of cold tea and a single handwritten note resting on the helm console. The note was brief, written in Gregory's distinctive, elegant fountain pen script. "The tide takes what it gives. I am tired of fighting the cold. Forgive me." Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed the script was a match to Gregory's personal journals. An extensive underwater sonar sweep of the surrounding oceanic trench yielded no body, But given the severe gale force currents, freezing water temperatures, and the clear suicidal note, the Maine State Police and the Knox County coroner officially declared Gregory Vance dead by suicide via drowning. The estate was closed, the antique bookshop was auctioned off to a commercial developer, and the case file was stamped closed, archived into the cold case drawer at the Camden station by the spring of 2018. For 4 continuous years, the tragedy was treated as a settled, unfortunate chapter in the town's local history. Ryan Vance eventually transitioned from lead criminal investigator to managing administrative operations, watching new files replace the old. Then came the freezing morning of the 14th of November 2022. A brutal early winter blizzard had dumped 10 inches of heavy, wet snow across coastal Maine, knocking out power to several harbor neighborhoods and turning Route 1 into a sheet of gray slush. Ryan arrived at the police station around 7:30 in the morning, carrying a cardboard cup of coffee, shaking the snow from his wool coat. Sitting directly in the center of his desk was the morning mail delivery, sorted by the front desk clerk. Lying on top of the pile of municipal utility notices and interdepartmental memos was a thick, heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with a circular wax stamp of dark red paraffin. The envelope had no printed postage barcode, no postal cancellation mark, and no return address. It had been hand-delivered, slipped directly through the exterior drop slot of the Camden Police Department during the middle of the blizzard overnight. Written across the front of the envelope, in fresh, flowing black India ink, was Ryan's full name and rank, Detective Ryan Vance, Case File 2017-449. Ryan pulled off his gloves and stared at the handwriting. A strange, cold sensation settled in his stomach. The script was unmistakable. The sweeping loops of the capital letters, the precise slant of the vowels, and the sharp terminal strokes were the exact stylistic hallmarks of Gregory Vance, the man officially declared dead 4 years earlier. Ryan grabbed a metal letter opener from his desk drawer, carefully slicing along the top seam of the envelope without disturbing the wax seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavy cotton archival paper, accompanied by a small, rusted brass skeleton key measuring roughly 2 inches in length. Ryan unfolded the paper, smoothed it out across his desk under the fluorescent office lights, and read the letter. The ink was sharp, dark, and completely fresh, smelling faintly of linseed oil and mineral turpentine. The letter read, "Ryan, you looked for me in the deep water because the water was convenient. You read the note on the dory because the words gave you an easy conclusion. You closed the file because the living always prefer an orderly death over an unfinished puzzle." The dory was a decoy. The note was composed under instruction. "I am not beneath the waves of Penobscot Bay. I have not left the peninsula. For 1,847 days, I have been waiting beneath the foundations of the carriage house at 348 High Street. The brass key opens the lower iron grate behind the root cellar shelving. Come alone before the snow melts, or you will only find what the winter preserves." The letter was signed at the bottom, Gregory Vance, the 13th of November, 2022. Ryan sat motionless in his swivel chair, the quiet hum of the station heater suddenly sounding deafening. He read the words 3 times, his pulse quickening with every pass. 348 High Street was the address of Gregory's ancestral property on the bluff. Following the closure of the probate estate in 2019, the primary 3-story house had been purchased by a wealthy family from New York as a summer vacation residence. However, the detached stone and timber carriage house at the rear of the property had remained completely boarded up, unused, and neglected due to severe historical structural preservation covenants. Ryan immediately called the state crime lab in Augusta, requesting an urgent, expedited chemical test on the ink and paper stock, while quietly notifying the on-duty patrol sergeant that he was conducting an immediate field follow-up on a reopened historical lead. He strapped on his service weapon, grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight, tossed a heavy crowbar into the back of his 4-wheel drive department SUV, and drove out through the drifting snow toward the North Bluffs. The drive along High Street was slow and treacherous. The ocean below the cliffs was a churning mass of dark slate-gray water throwing plumes of white spray against the jagged granite rocks. Ryan pulled up the long, unplowed gravel driveway of 348 High Street at approximately 9:15 in the morning. The main summer house was entirely shuttered for the winter season, its expansive windows covered with dark plywood storm panels. Behind the main residence, half hidden behind towering stands of white pine and frozen hemlock, stood the two-story carriage house. Its weathered cedar shingles were black with moisture, the roofline sagging under the weight of the fresh snow, and the heavy double wooden barn doors were secured with an old rusted chain and padlock. Ryan pulled his wool watch cap low over his ears, grabbed his flashlight and crowbar, and stepped out into the knee-deep snow. As he walked around the perimeter of the carriage house toward the rear foundation, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. In the fresh snow along the north wall, partially sheltered beneath the wide wooden eaves of the roof, was a distinct set of fresh, deep boot prints. The tracks were crisp, completely unmarred by the morning wind, leading directly toward an exterior wooden bulkhead door set into the fieldstone foundation. The wooden bulkhead doors, which had supposedly been nailed shut during the probate estate closure 4 years ago, were unlatched. The heavy iron hasp hung open, and the door was propped ajar by roughly 2 inches with a flat river stone. Ryan drew his department-issued Glock 22, holding the weapon in his right hand while gripping the tactical flashlight in his left. He used the toe of his heavy winter boot to nudge the bulkhead door open. The hinges screamed in protest, sending a sheet of crusty snow sliding down the wooden planks. A blast of bitterly cold, stale air escaped from the dark cellar void, carrying an overpowering smell of damp lime mortar, wet earth, and the distinct, unmistakable scent of burning paraffin wax. Ryan switched on his tactical light, aiming the wide, powerful beam down the steep flight of slippery wooden cellar steps. He descended slowly, step by deliberate step, his boots crunching over decades of accumulated grit and fallen plaster chips. When he reached the dirt floor of the cellar, he panned the light around the low-ceilinged space. The room was roughly 30 feet square, walled with heavy, unmortared fieldstone. Rows of rotting wooden shelves stood along the perimeter, filled with empty vintage mason jars, rusted gardening tools, and broken window sashes. Ryan walked toward the far back wall where the letter had indicated. Standing against the center fieldstone pier was a massive 6-foot-tall wooden storage shelving unit, completely loaded with discarded stacks of historical maritime journals and brittle nautical charts. Ryan placed his left hand against the frame of the heavy shelf and pulled. The entire unit swung outward smoothly on hidden, heavily greased steel caster wheels set into the dirt, revealing a dark, vertical opening behind the stone wall. Set directly into the granite foundation was a narrow, heavy cast-iron grate measuring 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. In the center of the iron grate was an antique, heavy brass locking mechanism with a keyhole matching the exact shape of the rusted skeleton key resting inside Ryan's coat pocket. Ryan stepped forward, pulled the key from his pocket, and inserted it into the lock. The heavy brass tumblers turned with a sharp, heavy metallic clank that resonated through the subterranean foundation. Ryan pulled the iron grate outward. Behind the grate lay a narrow, dry-walled stone tunnel that descended at a gentle slope directly toward the edge of the granite bluff overlooking the sea. Positioned along the tunnel walls, every 10 feet were small, recessed alcoves holding burning wax candles, their small orange flames flickering gently in the draft. And resting on a rough wooden bench just 15 feet down the illuminated tunnel was a fresh, unopened envelope identical to the one delivered to the police station, pinned to the wood beneath a heavy, brass maritime chronometer whose mechanical balance wheel was ticking with loud, rhythmic precision in the dead silence. Ryan took 2 slow, calculated steps into the candlelit tunnel, his service weapon raised and locked in a 2-handed grip. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the maritime chronometer filled the damp underground passageway, keeping time with the muffled roar of the Atlantic surf crashing against the granite cliffs outside. He reached the wooden bench, kept his eyes sweeping the flickering shadows ahead, and picked up the second envelope with his left hand. He slid his thumb under the flap, breaking the red wax seal. Inside was a single, folded nautical chart of Penobscot Bay, heavily marked with coordinates, along with a brief, handwritten instruction in that same unmistakable black ink. Keep walking to the observation bunker. He is waiting in the chair. Ryan continued down the stone-walled corridor. The air grew progressively colder, carrying a sharp, salty sea mist as the tunnel sloped toward the cliff face. 30 feet further, the passage opened into a vaulted, octagonal chamber built directly inside the natural sea cavern beneath the bluff. A forgotten World War II coastal defense observation post constructed in the early 1940s. A wide, horizontal, concrete observation slit looked directly out over the boiling gray waters of the bay. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by the cold, pale daylight filtering through the slit, sat an antique wooden armchair facing the ocean. Sitting upright in the chair was the figure of an elderly man, dressed in a heavy wool peacoat, dark canvas trousers, and leather boots, his head resting slightly back against the high wooden frame. Ryan moved forward cautiously, his flashlight beam pinning the figure in harsh white light. "Police! Keep your hands where I can see them!" There was no movement, no breath, no response. Ryan approached the side of the chair, his fingers pressing against the cold skin of the man's neck. There was no pulse. The man was Gregory Vance. His body was completely intact, frozen solid in the sub-freezing coastal air, preserved by the natural cold storage of the subterranean bunker. But forensic examination of his skin and the surrounding dust revealed something that defied all medical logic. Gregory had not passed away 5 years ago in 2017. He had died less than 48 hours earlier. Resting on Gregory's lap was a portable microcassette recorder wired with an external lapel microphone, alongside a thick spiral dossier stamped with property transfer deeds and banking records. Ryan clicked the playback button on the recorder. A raspy, labored voice, cracked with age and exhaustion, yet unmistakably that of Gregory Vance, began to speak through the small speaker. "Ryan, if you are hearing this, the final letter reached your desk in time. For 5 years, I did not live. I was kept down here. In October of 2017, I discovered that the developer managing the Municipal Harbor Reclamation Project was systematically liquidating protected coastal parcels through forged historical deeds. When I confronted him with the original colonial charters from my archive, he did not kill me. He knew that an unsolved murder would draw state police scrutiny and freeze the land titles in probate. He forced me to write that suicide note under duress, drove my dory out to Vinyl Haven to stage my drowning, and locked me in this bunker beneath the carriage house. He brought food once a week. He kept me alive only because my signature was required on staggered trust distributions that unlocked $30 million in commercial harbor assets over a 5-year vesting cycle. 2 nights ago, the final vesting period concluded. He brought the last document for me to sign, and he left me here without heat or provisions to let the winter finish the job. He did not know I had spent 40 months carving a loose stone out of the drainage flue to reach the upper carriage house, or that I had kept this archival paper hidden in the wall. I wrote the letter with the last of my strength and walked it to your station before the blizzard trapped me. Everything you need to convict him is in this dossier." The recording clicked off with a sharp mechanical snap. Ryan stood in the freezing bunker, his jaw clenched, staring at the detailed corporate ledgers resting on Gregory's knees. The developer, named throughout the documents, the man who had orchestrated the abduction, forged the historical land sales, and visited the hidden bunker under the cover of darkness for 5 years, was Marcus Sterling, a prominent Camden City Council member and the head of the Regional Planning Commission. Ryan called in immediate tactical backup. Within 2 hours, state police units surrounded Marcus Sterling's waterfront estate in Rockport, arresting him just as he was loading luggage into his vehicle to board an international flight out of Boston. Forensic units searching Sterling's home recovered the master keys to the carriage house bulkhead, matching carbon paper used to trace Gregory's signatures, and surveillance equipment used to monitor the Bluff property. The case that had sat stamped closed as a tragic suicide in 2017 was formally reopened and converted to charges of aggravated kidnapping, financial fraud, and first-degree murder. Marcus Sterling was convicted in Knox County Superior Court and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gregory Vance was finally laid to rest with full honors in the historic coastal cemetery overlooking the bay he had dedicated his life to preserving, closing the final, terrifying chapter of the mystery letter that refused to let the truth stay buried in the dark.